Thank you for joining in today's Cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Static in the Canopy. This is a horror story about the Thunderbird. And in this story, a small group of 5, led by a disgraced biologist obsessed with relic hominids, and a cautious wilderness guide, venture into a restricted, high-altitude valley in the Pacific Northwest. They aren't looking for a myth. They are tracking a series of anomalous weather events, localized lightning strikes that occur in perfectly circular patterns, even under clear skies. The second story today is called The Gilded Ossuary. This is a horror story about pygmy mummies. And in this story, a prestigious archaeological team, funded by a private collector, discovers a ruin in a remote, arid region of Egypt. Unlike the Grand Pyramids, this is a subtomb. It is a claustrophobic, mineral-rich vein of limestone that looks more like a natural cave than a burial chamber. The team finds a central chamber containing a single, tiny sarcophagus made of black basalt. Inside is not a pharaoh, but a creature, a 14-inch humanoid, desiccated and leather-like, curled in a tight fetal position. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Static in the Canopy. The internal organs are intact, but the skeletal structure has been collapsed inward, as if the victim was vacuum-sealed into a smaller space. Dr. Elaine Voss spoke these words into the microphone suspended above the stainless steel table, her voice carrying the flat affect of a woman who had spent 20 years cataloging the impossible, and had learned that the only way to survive the work was to render it in language so clinical that it became abstract, a problem of terminology rather than terror. The coroner, a county appointee named Harold Finch who had spent 3 decades certifying heart attacks and hunting accidents, stood at the edge of the light with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture suggesting a man who was trying to prevent himself from reaching forward to cover the remains with a sheet, as though concealment might restore some dignity to what lay upon the steel. The remains belonged to a male in his early 30s, identified by the hunting license in his wallet as Jeremy Holt, an accountant from Spokane who had taken a week's vacation to hike the restricted valleys of the northern Cascades. His internal organs were indeed intact, gleaming in their open cavities with a wet freshness that suggested they had been removed from a living body only hours before. But the cavity that contained them was wrong. The ribcage, which should have arched outward in a protective barrel, had been compressed into a concave bowl no wider than a dinner plate. The spine had accordion folded, the vertebrae grinding into one another with a force that had extruded the spinal cord through the foramen magnum like toothpaste from a tube. The skull was the only part of the skeleton that retained its original dimensions, and it sat atop the collapsed neck with an expression of startled perplexity, the eyes open, the pupils fixed, the mouth frozen in a rictus that might have been a scream had there been lungs remaining to power it. "Hunting accident," Finch repeated, his voice barely audible above the ventilation system's hum. "That's what the report says. Hunting accident." Voss clicked off the microphone and looked at him with eyes that were gray and depthless as river stones. "Mr. Holt was dropped from approximately 3,000 feet, she said. The compression occurred during the fall, when whatever was carrying him released its grip and allowed gravity to complete the work. The tissue damage is consistent with rapid decompression followed by blunt force impact, but the skeleton was crushed before the fall. It was crushed while he was still alive, Mr. Finch. The marrow aspirate shows elevated lactate levels consistent with extreme physiological stress prior to death. He felt it. He felt himself being folded." Finch turned away. He did not ask what could fold a human skeleton like a napkin. He had seen the photographs from the retrieval team, the photographs that were not included in the official file. The circular indentation in the earth where Holt had been found, 8 feet in diameter and 6 inches deep, as though a massive weight had pressed against the soil from above. the parallel gouges in the tree trunks surrounding the site, gouges that began at 20 feet and continued upward until they vanished into the canopy. And the feather, if it could be called a feather, a single black filament the size of a canoe paddle, serrated along its edge like a steak knife, embedded in a cedar tree at a height of 40 feet. The retrieval team had photographed it and left it where it was. They had been in a hurry to leave the valley. Finch had not blamed them. He signed the death certificate. He wrote hunting accident in the blank for cause of death, and he filed the report in a cabinet that was already swollen with similar cases that stretched back through the decades like beads on a rosary, each one marked with the same red stamp that indicated restricted access, each one involving a body that had been dropped from a height that no cliff in the valley could provide. There were 37 cases in the cabinet. Finch had signed 22 of them. He had never once written the truth, because the truth was not a cause of death that could be entered on a government form. The truth was a sound like thunder under a cloudless sky, and a shadow that moved against the wind, and a static charge that made the hair on your arms stand up seconds before the darkness took you. The truth was a creature that the indigenous peoples had called by names that were older than the mountains themselves, a creature that did not hunt like a bear or a wolf, but like something that had evolved in a world where gravity was optional, and the sky was not empty but occupied. Lewis Cade did not believe in monsters. He believed in evolutionary gaps, in the fossil record silences, in the possibility that the megafauna of the Pleistocene had not all perished in the warming, but had retreated into the planet's remaining wilderness, adapting and shrinking and surviving in niches that modern biology had not yet mapped. For 15 years, he had been a professor of zoology at the University of Washington, a position he had lost not through incompetence but through obsession, through his refusal to abandon his research into what he called relic hominids and what his colleagues had called Sasquatch fetishism. The final straw had been a paper published in a predatory journal. A paper that argued, with maps and thermal imaging and audio spectrographs, that a population of large, unidentified avians was responsible for the cluster of disappearances in the Cascade Range between 1987 and the present. The university had not fired him outright. They had simply declined to renew his tenure, had reassigned his graduate students, had allowed his office to be converted into a storage closet for unused projector carts. The message had been clear enough. Lewis had taken his maps and his spectrographs and his dignity, what remained of it, and had retreated to a rented cabin outside of Bellingham, where he spent his days compiling data and his nights drinking bourbon and staring at satellite imagery of the valleys. He was no longer permitted to enter. Sarah Chen had agreed to guide him into one of those valleys, not because she believed in his theories, but because she needed the money. She was 34, a wilderness guide with 12 years of experience leading hunters and hikers through the high country of the Pacific Northwest, and she had learned early in her career that belief was a luxury that the wilderness did not reward. She believed in terrain, in weather, in the concrete particulars of elevation and wind speed and soil composition. She did not believe in the Thunderbird, though she had heard the stories from her grandmother, a woman of the Colville Confederated tribes who had spoken of the bird in the ceremonial longhouse with a reverence that bordered on terror. Sarah had filed those stories in the same mental compartment where she kept her childhood fear of the dark, real in their emotional impact perhaps, but not real in the sense that a blizzard or a grizzly bear was real. She had seen men die in the wilderness. She had pulled a hypothermic teenager from a crevasse on Mount Baker and had watched the boy's fingers turn black in the hours before the helicopter arrived. She knew what real danger looked like, and it did not look like a giant bird. It looked like bad judgment, inadequate gear, and the indifferent physics of cold and gravity. But the money was good. Lewis had secured funding from a tech entrepreneur named Marcus Webb, who had made his fortune in cloud computing, and had spent the last decade converting that fortune into a collection of eccentric hobbies that included deep-sea exploration, cryonics, and cryptozoology. Marcus did not particularly care whether Lewis found his Thunderbird. He cared about the story, the documentary, the social media content that would cement his reputation as a modern-day adventurer. He had hired a film crew, but the Forest Service permit for the restricted valley stipulated that no motorized vehicles or drone equipment could enter the zone, so Marcus had compromised by bringing a photographer named David Ayers, a former mountaineering instructor who had shot for National Geographic, and who carried his equipment with the fatalism of a man who had learned that the best shots were usually the ones that happened after the plan fell apart. The fifth member of the expedition was Elena Vargas, Lewis's former graduate student, who had followed him into exile with a loyalty that Lewis found touching and Sarah found troubling. Elena was 26, brilliant in the way that only the very young could be brilliant, her mind still flexible enough to accommodate impossibilities without breaking. She believed in Lewis's theories with a fervor that made Sarah want to shake her. They assembled at the trailhead on a Tuesday morning in late August, the sky above the Cascade Range a depthless blue that seemed to have been vacuum-sealed over the peaks. The air was thin at 6,000 feet, carrying a chill that suggested autumn was already moving through the high passes, and Sarah checked her GPS and her satellite beacon with a ritual precision that bordered on the religious. The valley they were entering was officially unnamed, marked on USGS maps only as a topographic contour in a region designated as restricted due to unstable geological conditions. The Forest Service had not maintained the trail in 20 years. The last biological survey had been conducted in 1994, and the report, which Lewis had obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, had been heavily redacted, whole pages blacked out with a thoroughness that suggested not bureaucratic caution but active concealment. Sarah had read the report. The unredacted portions mentioned anomalous avian activity and localized atmospheric disturbances, and recommended that the valley be placed off-limits to recreational use until further study could be completed. The further study had never happened. They hiked for 6 hours on the first day, following a creek bed that narrowed as it climbed, the walls of the valley drawing together like the jaws of a vise. The forest was old-growth cedar and Douglas fir, trees that had been saplings when the first European explorers had mapped the coastline, and the canopy was so dense that the daylight filtered through in a perpetual twilight, a green-gold luminescence that made Sarah feel as though she were walking through the interior of a submerged cathedral. Marcus complained about his boots. David photographed the moss that hung from the branches in curtains of chartreuse and emerald, his camera clicking with a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the stillness. Elena walked beside Lewis, taking notes in a waterproof journal, sketching the lichen patterns that Lewis insisted were markers of large animal territory. And Sarah walked ahead, her eyes on the terrain, her rifle, loaded with solid slugs, not buckshot, ready across her shoulder, her mind cataloging the 1,000 small details that could kill a person in country like this. A loose stone, a rotted log, a sudden drop masked by ferns. By late afternoon, they reached the meadow where they would make camp. It was a high alpine bowl, perhaps 2 acres of wildflowers and bunchgrass, bordered on 3 sides by cliffs that rose in sheer walls of basalt and granite. The 4th side opened onto the continuation of the valley, a narrowing throat of forest that led to the cirque where Lewis's research suggested the anomalous weather events were concentrated. Sarah chose a site near the creek, on a raised bench of gravel that would drain in case of rain, and she supervised the pitching of the tents with a military efficiency that brooked no argument. Lewis wanted to push on to the cirque before dark, to set up his audio recording equipment while the thermals were still active. Sarah told him no. The cliffs were unstable, she said. The light was failing, And there was something about the meadow that she did not like, a quality of silence that was not peaceful but anticipatory, as though the valley were holding its breath. They built a fire as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, the light draining from the sky in a sequence of colors that began with gold and ended with a bruised purple that seemed to pool in the hollows of the terrain. Sarah prepared freeze-dried chili and instant coffee, and they ate in a silence that was broken only by Marcus's complaints about the food and David's occasional comments about the light, which he described as impossibly rich and like something out of a Flemish painting. Louis ate mechanically, his eyes on the map he had spread across his knees, a topographic survey on which he had marked the locations of the reported lightning strikes. They formed a pattern, he said, a nearly perfect circle 2 miles in diameter, centered on the cirque. The strikes had been recorded by a NOAA weather station 40 miles away, and they had occurred on 3 separate occasions in the last 18 months, always in July or August, always between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning, always under conditions of clear sky and low humidity. The meteorologists had classified them as positive lightning, a rare phenomenon associated with severe thunderstorms, but there had been no storms in the area on any of the 3 dates. The strikes had been solitary, isolated, and had left craters in the meadow grass that were still visible as circular depressions, 8 feet across, the soil inside them fused into a glassy ceramic. Ball lightning, Marcus suggested, his mouth full of chili. I read about that, swamp gas and Elmo's fire, whatever. There's always a scientific explanation. Louis looked at him with an expression that managed to combine pity and contempt without using either emotion directly. Ball lightning does not create craters, he said. Ball lightning does not leave feathers embedded in trees at 40 feet. Ball lightning does not compress a human skeleton into a space the size of a volleyball. The silence that followed this statement was deeper than the silence of the meadow. Even Marcus, who had been about to offer another theory, closed his mouth and stared into his chili. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had not known about the compressed skeleton. She had not known about the feather. Louis had kept those details from her during the planning stages, had spoken only of anomalous weather and unidentified avian species, and the revelation that he had been withholding forensic evidence made her want to stand up and walk back down the trail, to leave him and his obsession in the darkening meadow and not stop until she reached her truck. But she did not stand up. She sat very still, her spoon halfway to her mouth, and she listened to the forest. It was too quiet. That was the thing she noticed first, the thing that made the hair on her forearms rise beneath her sleeves. In a healthy forest, even at dusk, there was sound, the chirp of insects, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl staking its territorial claim. But here, in this meadow, at this elevation, there was nothing. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was occupied by a presence that seemed to be listening as intently as Sarah was, a presence that had folded itself into the spaces between the trees and was waiting for something to happen. She looked at Louis, meaning to tell him that they were breaking camp at first light and hiking out regardless of his research agenda, but the words died in her throat when she saw his face. He was looking up, his head tilted back, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the canopy, and his expression was not fear but recognition, the look of a man who has spent years searching for a signal and has finally heard it. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Sarah listened. At first, she heard nothing. Then, gradually, she became aware of a sensation that was not quite a sound but not quite silence either, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, or perhaps from the air, a pressure against her eardrums that was accompanied by a nausea so subtle she almost missed it. It was like standing at the base of a dam, feeling the weight of the water through the concrete, a subsonic hum that made her teeth ache and her vision shimmer at the edges. Alina had heard it too. She was standing now, her notebook forgotten, her face pale in the firelight. David had set down his camera and was looking at the trees with an expression that suggested he was trying to identify a smell. Only Marcus seemed unaffected, but Marcus was already pouring himself a second cup of chili and did not notice the change in atmosphere because he was not the kind of man who noticed atmospheres. "It's the creek," Sarah said, though she did not believe it. "Water hitting a resonant frequency in the bedrock." Lewis shook his head slowly. "It's not the creek, it's the static. That's what the indigenous reports call it. The static, it's a precursor." "A precursor to what?" Sarah asked, but Lewis did not answer, because the deer chose that moment to reveal itself, and the revelation was enough to stop all conversation. It was lying at the edge of the meadow, 20 yards from the fire, and none of them had seen it until Elena's flashlight beam swept across it. It was a mule deer, a buck, and it was dead. But dead was not the word. Destroyed was closer. Crushed was closer still. The animal lay on its side, its body intact from the shoulders forward, its head preserved in an expression of placid incomprehension. But from the ribcage back, the body had been flattened to a thickness of no more than 6 inches. The ribcage, which should have arched protectively over the internal organs, had been driven downward with a force that had extruded the intestines through the pelvic girdle in a rope of gray and pink that glistened in the flashlight beam. The spine was visible as a zigzag line of white bone that had been shattered into segments no larger than poker chips. And the skin, which should have been torn by teeth or claws, was unbroken. It was simply stretched over the crushed architecture beneath it, drum-tight, translucent, revealing the obliterated geometry of the skeleton in a way that made Sarah think of anatomical models, of educational diagrams, of the way a crushed soda can retain its original labeling even as its structure fails. No one spoke for a long time. David was the first to move, approaching the carcass with his camera raised, but Sarah caught his arm and held him back with a grip that made him wince. "Don't," she said. "Don't touch it, don't photograph it. We need to leave. Now." "This is evidence," Lewis said, his voice thick with a hunger that Sarah found repulsive. "This is the first physical evidence. Don't you understand? This is what we came for." "This is a warning," Sarah said, and her voice was hard as the granite cliffs above them. "This is something marking its territory, and we are in it." She pulled David back toward the fire, and the others followed, Marcus finally catching the contagion of their fear and looking around the meadow with wide eyes. They sat in a circle around the dying embers, their weapons, Sarah's rifle, David's climbing axe, Marcus's satellite phone that suddenly seemed like a toy close at hand, and they waited for the dark to do whatever the dark intended to do. The static continued, a low-frequency hum that seemed to have settled into their bones, a vibration that made Sarah's hands tremble on the stock of her rifle. She had been in dangerous situations before. She had faced bears and blizzards and unstable ice bridges, and she had learned that fear was a tool, a physiological response that sharpened the senses and prepared the body for action. But this fear was different. This fear was not accompanied by adrenaline. It was accompanied by a paralysis, a heaviness in the limbs that suggested the nervous system was being overridden by something external, something that operated on frequencies the human body was not equipped to resist. Elena was the first to succumb. She curled into her sleeping bag not long after midnight, her face gray and sweating, complaining of a headache that she described as like pressure from the inside. Sarah checked her pupils with a penlight and found them dilated but equal, her pulse rapid but regular. There was no fever. There was no sign of concussion or altitude sickness. There was only the static, and Elena's body responding to it with symptoms that Sarah could not diagnose. She gave her ibuprofen and water and watched her until her breathing steadied into sleep. Then Sarah took the first watch, sitting with her back to the fire, her rifle across her knees, her eyes on the darkness beyond the ring of light. The stars were brilliant, a spill of diamonds across the black velvet of the sky, and Sarah tried to find comfort in their familiarity. She had spent hundreds of nights in the wilderness, and the stars had always been her companions, fixed and distant and indifferent. But tonight, they seemed wrong. They seemed to shimmer in a pattern that suggested not atmospheric distortion but movement, a vibration in the upper reaches of the atmosphere that matched the frequency of the static below. She told herself it was an illusion, a product of fatigue and the low-frequency hum that was affecting her vestibular system. But when she looked directly overhead, she saw something that she could not explain away as illusion. It was a hole in the stars, a circular absence, perhaps 50 feet across, that moved against the wind with a deliberation that suggested intelligence. It was not a cloud. It was not a bird. It was a shape that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, a silhouette of such perfect blackness that it seemed to be not an object but a deletion, a place where the universe had been erased. And it was descending. Sarah watched it drop from the upper atmosphere with a speed that should have produced a sonic boom, a speed that should have torn the air apart. And yet it moved in absolute silence, the static rising in pitch to accommodate its passage until the vibration was no longer subsonic but audible, a hum that became a drone, that became a whine, that became a scream. She tried to raise her rifle, but her arms would not obey her. She tried to scream, but her throat was locked by the same paralysis that held her limbs. She could only watch, frozen in a posture of supplication, as the shape descended toward the meadow, toward their camp, toward the sleeping forms of her companions. And then the lightning came. It was not a bolt from the sky. It was a discharge that seemed to originate from the shape itself, a branching web of electricity that filled the air with a smell of ozone and burning hair, a light so intense that Sarah's vision whited out completely, leaving her blind and deaf and senseless in a world that had become pure energy. The sound that accompanied it was not thunder but something else, something that existed at the intersection of sound and pressure, a detonation that hit her chest like a physical blow and sent her sprawling backward into the fire, her hair singed, her skin blistering from the heat. She rolled, gasping, her sight returning in strobing flashes of purple and green, and she saw the shape rising again, its wings. She could see them now, vast and membranous and veined with light, beating against the air with a rhythm that stirred the meadow grass into a circular pattern, a crop circle of bent stems that radiated outward from a central point. And in the center of that circle, where Alina's sleeping bag had been, there was only the indentation, a circular depression in the earth, 8 feet across, the soil inside it compressed to a density that suggested thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch. The sleeping bag was still there, zipped closed, its nylon surface unbroken. But it was empty. Alina was gone. There was no blood. There was no scream. There was only the indentation and the smell of ozone and the distant sound of wingbeats fading into the upper atmosphere, a sound like a jet engine heard from miles away, a sound that vibrated in Sarah's sternum long after it had become inaudible. She crawled to the indentation. She touched the soil with her fingertips, and it was warm, baked to a ceramic hardness that had not been there before. She looked up at the sky, her eyes streaming tears from the afterimage of the flash, and she saw the stars returning to their positions, the hole in the heavens closing like a wound. The static was fading too, dropping in frequency until it became a subsonic hum again, then a memory, then a silence that was deeper and more terrible than the silence that had preceded it. Lewis was beside her, his face pale and his hands shaking. He was saying something, repeating a word over and over, and it took Sarah a moment to understand that the word was feather. He was pointing at a cedar tree on the edge of the meadow, a tree that had been there for 300 years and would be there no longer, because embedded in its trunk at a height of 40 feet was a single black filament the size of a surfboard. It was not a feather in any biological sense that Sarah understood. It was a blade. It was a weapon. It was serrated along its trailing edge with teeth of keratin that had been modified by evolution into something that resembled a steak knife more than anything intended for flight, and it pulsed with a residual charge that made Sarah's fingers sting when she reached toward it. Lewis was weeping. Not from fear but from vindication, from the terrible confirmation of a theory that he had pursued through disgrace and poverty and madness. And Sarah wanted to strike him, to drive her fist into his face until he understood that a theory confirmed by the death of a student was not a victory but a catastrophe. But she did not strike him. She lowered her hand and turned back to the camp, where Marcus was vomiting into the grass and David was standing with his camera in his hand, the lens shattered, the memory card presumably fried by the electromagnetic pulse of the discharge. The fire had gone out, the stars had returned, and Alina was gone, vacuum-sealed into a smaller space, dropped from 3,000 feet, her internal organs intact and her skeletal structure collapsed inward like a flower pressed between the pages of a book. Sarah did not sleep for the remainder of that night. She sat with her rifle across her knees and her eyes on the sky, waiting for the shape to return, waiting for the static to rise again, waiting for the lightning that would come under a cloudless sky and take them all. But the shape did not return. It had fed, or whatever equivalent of feeding applied to a creature that left its prey crushed and uneaten. It had marked its territory and demonstrated its dominance, and now it was waiting, circling in the upper atmosphere, monitoring them with senses that operated on frequencies beyond human perception. Sarah could feel it up there, a presence that registered not as a sound or a sight, but as a pressure against her consciousness, a weight that seemed to be pressing the air itself into a thinner and thinner layer, until she felt as though she were breathing at 20,000 feet despite being at less than 7,000. By dawn, the static had returned, not as a precursor but as a constant, a low-frequency hum that seemed to have become the baseline condition of the valley. The 4 survivors broke camp in a silence that was not mutual agreement but mutual trauma, each of them moving through the morning fog with the mechanical precision of shock victims. Marcus had stopped complaining. David had stopped photographing. Lewis had stopped theorizing. They packed their gear with a haste that bordered on panic, stuffing sleeping bags into sacks without rolling them, scattering cookware in their rush to be gone. Only Sarah moved with deliberation, her mind working through the problem with a desperation that felt like drowning. They were 20 miles from the trailhead. The terrain was steep and unforgiving, and they were being hunted. She did not say this to the others. She did not need to. They knew it in the same way she knew it, with a certainty that bypassed language and lodged itself in the amygdala, the ancient brain structure that understood predators before the neocortex had evolved to deny them. They moved in a column, Sarah in the lead, Lewis behind her, then Marcus, then David at the rear with his climbing axe held like a weapon. The static accompanied them, never fading, never intensifying, a constant reminder that the creature was there, waiting, patient. Sarah's hands trembled on the stock of her rifle, and she forced them steady with an act of will that felt like pushing against a wall. She had faced predators before. She had faced blizzards and bears and the screaming void of a crevasse. But she had never faced something that hunted like this, something that compressed its prey into smaller spaces and dropped them from impossible heights, something that turned the sky itself into a weapon. The morning arrived not with light but with a gray diffusion that seemed to seep upward from the earth rather than descend from the sky, as though the valley itself were generating its own illumination, a bioluminescence of fog and ash that made the trees appear as charcoal sketches against a background of wet wool. Sarah had not slept. She had sat with her back against a cedar tree, her rifle across her knees, her eyes burning with a fatigue that felt like sand under her eyelids, and she had watched the darkness for any movement that violated the ordinary rules of shadow and wind. There had been none. The creature, whatever it was, had taken Alina and had not returned, and the silence that followed its departure was not peaceful but forensic, the silence of a crime scene after the perpetrator has fled, a silence that invited examination and promised horror. When the gray light finally grew strong enough to distinguish shapes, Sarah rose from her position with a stiffness that made her wince, her joints protesting in a language of pain that she had learned to ignore during her years in the wilderness. She walked to the indentation where Alina had slept, and she stood over it for a long time, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were showing her. The sleeping bag was still zipped. That was the detail that Sarah kept returning to, the fact that seemed to violate not just the laws of physics but the laws of narrative sense. The sleeping bag was a mummy-style bag, rated to 15 degrees, with a hood that cinched around the face and a draft collar that prevented cold air from entering at the shoulders. Alina had crawled into it the night before, had joked about the smell of the freeze-dried chili on her breath, had pulled the hood tight and wished Sarah good night with a smile that had seemed, in retrospect, unbearably young. And now the bag was empty, its nylon shell collapsed onto the ground like a shed skin, its zipper still closed, its fabric unbroken. There was no tear. There was no blood. There was only the indentation in the earth beneath it, a circular depression 8 feet across and 6 inches deep, the soil inside it compressed to a ceramic hardness that Sarah could feel through the soles of her boots. She touched the sleeping bag with her fingertips, and it was cold, the cold of a bag that had not contained a living body for hours, and she smelled the faint residue of ozone that clung to the nylon like a perfume. Louis joined her not long after, his face a gray mask that seemed to have absorbed the color of the morning light. He carried his notebook and a pen, and he moved with a precision that Sarah recognized as the mechanical behavior of a man who has decided that observation is the only alternative to screaming. He knelt beside the indentation and began to measure it with a tape measure, his hand steady, his voice murmuring numbers that Sarah did not bother to record. 8 feet in diameter, 6 inches at the deepest point. The edges were not cratered but smoothed, as though a massive weight had been lowered onto the soil with a gentleness that was more terrifying than force would have been. Louis pressed his palm against the compressed earth and closed his eyes, and Sarah saw his lips moving in a silent calculation that she knew had nothing to do with soil compaction and everything to do with the impossible. "It landed here," Louis said, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. It settled its weight onto the ground directly above her. The pressure displaced the soil. Then it took her. "Through the sleeping bag?" Sarah asked. "Through a closed zipper." Louis opened his eyes and looked at her, and she saw in his expression a desperation that matched her own. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know how it took her. I only know that it did." Marcus emerged from his tent with a complexion that suggested he had spent the night vomiting, which Sarah suspected was the case. He had not said a word since the flash, had curled into his sleeping bag with a silence that was not stoic but catatonic, and now he stood at the edge of the camp with his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the indentation, with an expression that Sarah could only describe as the look of a man who has realized that his money cannot buy safety. He was wearing designer hiking boots that had cost more than Sarah's truck, and they were already scuffed and mud-caked, and the absurdity of this detail, the pristine boots ruined by the reality of the wilderness, struck Sarah with a force that made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. She did neither. She walked to Marcus and placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles, the tremor that ran through his frame like a current. "We need to move," she said. "We need to get out of this valley and back to the trailhead, today, now." Marcus looked at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and swollen. "My satellite phone," he said. "It's dead. The battery was full yesterday, but now it's dead. Nothing works. Nothing electronic works." Sarah turned to David, who was sitting on a rock with his camera in his lap, turning it over in his hands with a methodical slowness that suggested he was trying to understand how it had failed him. "Mine too," David said without looking up. "The lens is cracked. The memory card is blank. It's not just dead, it's erased." "Electromagnetic pulse," Louis said, still kneeling beside the indentation. "The discharge generated an EMP. It fried everything with a circuit. That's why the satellite phones are dead. That's why the cameras are blank. It's not hunting us with tooth and claw, it's hunting us with electricity. I don't care what it's hunting us with, Sarah said, and her voice was hard as the granite cliffs above them. I care about getting out of this valley before it comes back. Pack your gear. We leave in 10 minutes. They packed in silence, moving with a haste that bordered on panic. Sarah supervised with a ruthless efficiency, forcing them to leave behind anything that was not essential. The tents, the cooking gear, the extra clothing, Lewis's notebooks. She made him choose one, only one, and he chose the leather-bound journal that contained his most recent observations, clutching it to his chest like a talisman. They traveled light, each carrying only water, protein bars, and the weapons they had brought. Sarah's rifle, David's climbing axe, Lewis's trekking pole that suddenly seemed inadequate, Marcus's empty hands that kept clenching and unclenching as though searching for a weapon that did not exist. Sarah set a brutal pace, following the creek bed downstream, knowing that the trailhead lay to the east and that the creek would eventually lead them to a tributary that intersected the main trail. She did not look up. She did not look at the sky. She kept her eyes on the terrain, on the roots and rocks and the water that flowed over stones with a sound that was ordinarily soothing, but now seemed like the laughter of something that knew they were fleeing. The static accompanied them. It was not as intense as it had been during the night, but it was present, a subsonic hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, a vibration that Sarah could feel in her teeth and her sternum and the arches of her feet. It rose in pitch when they passed through clearings, dropping to a barely perceptible thrum when they moved beneath the canopy, and Sarah began to understand that the creature was tracking them, not visually but electrically, using the static as a kind of sonar that mapped their position by the disturbances they caused in the ambient field. The canopy provided some shielding, the trees acting as grounding rods that disrupted the creature's electrical sense, but the shielding was imperfect, and every time they were forced to cross an open meadow or a gravel bar, the static rose to a pitch that made Sarah's vision shimmer at the edges. By midday, the symptoms had begun. It started with Marcus, who complained of a headache that he described as like someone tightening a vice around my skull. Then David, who stopped to vomit beside a boulder and emerged with a gray complexion and trembling hands. Then Lewis, whose joints began to ache with a specificity that suggested not exertion but something deeper, something in the blood. Sarah felt it too, a pressure in her sinuses that made her ears pop repeatedly, a pain in her knees and elbows that suggested bubbles forming in her tissues, the nitrogen that had dissolved in her blood at sea level coming out of solution as the ambient pressure dropped. But they were not ascending. They were walking along a creek bed at 7,000 feet, an altitude they had maintained since yesterday, and the pressure should have been constant. The only explanation was the creature, the wing beats that Lewis had theorized, were creating a localized low-pressure zone, a vortex of spinning air that mimicked the conditions of rapid ascent and triggered decompression sickness in their bodies. The bends, Sarah said, as they rested in the shade of a Douglas fir that had fallen across the creek. It's giving us the bends. Lewis nodded, his face pale and sweating. It's hovering above us. Its wing beats are manipulating the air pressure. It's not just hunting us, it's preparing us, tenderizing us. Preparing us for what? Marcus asked, his voice high and cracked. For the discharge, Lewis said. The electricity travels more efficiently through tissues that have been decompressed. The nitrogen bubbles create pathways. It's optimizing us for the kill. Sarah did not ask if he was certain. She did not want to know if he was certain. She only knew that her left knee was swollen to twice its normal size, that her vision was developing black spots that floated across her field of view like ink in water, and that every time they moved into open ground, the pain intensified. She also knew, with a certainty that felt like prophecy, that the creature was hurting them. It was not allowing them to escape. It was driving them deeper into the valley, toward a destination that it had chosen, a kill zone that offered the optimal conditions for its method of predation. She kept this knowledge from the others. She did not tell them that the trail they were following was not leading east toward the trailhead but curving south, deeper into the restricted zone, toward the cirque where the lightning strikes had been concentrated. She did not tell them that the creature was above them, visible now not as a shape but as a hole in the clouds, a circular absence that moved with a deliberation that suggested intelligence. She only told them to keep moving, to stay under the trees, to drink water and swallow aspirin, and ignore the pain that was becoming a constant companion. They found the bear at 4 in the afternoon. It was a grizzly, perhaps 800 pounds in life, and it had been killed with the same efficiency that had killed the deer and taken Alina. The rib cage was flattened, the spine compressed, the internal organs extruded through the pelvic girdle in a mass that had begun to attract flies but had not yet begun to rot. The smell was not the smell of death but the smell of cooked meat, of protein that had been flash-heated by the discharge before the body had been dropped. And above the carcass, in the branches of a lightning-scarred cedar, was the feather. It was larger than the first one, larger than a surfboard, and it was not black but iridescent, shifting between purple and green and blue in the afternoon light. The serrations along its edge were visible from the ground, each tooth a hooked barb of keratin that could slice through flesh with the ease of a scalpel. Lewis reached for it, his hand trembling, and Sarah did not stop him. She was beyond stopping him. She was beyond anything except the mechanical process of putting one foot in front of the other, of breathing in and out, of waiting for the next discharge and the next disappearance. Lewis pulled the feather from the branch. It came free with a sound like a sword being drawn from its scabbard, and he held it in both hands, his face illuminated by its iridescent sheen, his expression that of a man holding the Holy Grail or the devil's own knife. "Serrated steel," he whispered. "Not steel, keratin, but modified, reinforced. The microstructure. Look at the microstructure. It's laminated, like Damascus steel, like a sword forged by a god." "It's a claw," David said, and his voice was the calmest Sarah had heard since the night before. "Not a feather, a wing claw like a bat, like the Archaeopteryx, but scaled to a size that—" He trailed off, his eyes on the canopy above them, and Sarah followed his gaze and saw what he had seen. The trees were moving. Not in the wind, there was no wind, but in response to a pressure from above, a downwash of air that bent the upper branches in a circular pattern, a vortex that was centered on their position. The static had risen to a pitch that was now audible, a whine that climbed the scale with a deliberation that suggested preparation, that suggested targeting. Sarah looked at the sky through the gaps in the canopy and saw the shape again, closer now, close enough that she could make out details that her brain refused to process. The wings, not feathered but membranous, stretched over fingers that were longer than her arm. The body, lean and aerodynamic, shaped like a spearhead. And the head, small and sleek, with eyes that glowed not red but white, incandescent like arc lamps in a theater. "Run," she said, but the word was swallowed by the static, which had become a roar, a physical wall of sound that pressed against her chest and drove her to her knees. She saw Lewis drop the feather and stumble backward, his arms windmilling, his mouth open in a scream that produced no sound. She saw Marcus turn and run, not toward the trail but into the underbrush, his panic overriding his judgment, his body crashing through ferns and saplings in a desperate flight that was doomed from its first step. She saw David raise his climbing axe, a gesture that was brave and futile and heartbreaking in its inadequacy. And then the lightning came. It was not a single bolt. It was a web, a branching network of electricity that filled the grove with a light so intense that Sarah's vision whited out instantly, leaving her in a world of pure white pain. The sound was not thunder but a crack, a detonation that seemed to originate inside her own skull, a pressure wave that burst her left eardrum and sent a spray of blood from her nose. She felt her muscles lock, her nervous system overridden by the discharge, every fiber of her body contracting at once in a spasm that threw her backward against a tree trunk. She felt her teeth crack together, felt her jaw muscles straining against the lock, felt her bladder release in a hot rush that she could not control. She was paralyzed, blind, deaf, a statue of meat and bone waiting for the predator to descend and complete its work. But the predator did not descend. Not yet. She felt the pressure of its wings above her, the downwash stirring the leaves into a cyclone, and she knew that it was hovering, inspecting its prey, selecting which one to take first. She could not see. She could not move. She could only wait, trapped in a body that had become a prison, and feel the presence of the creature as a weight against her consciousness, a pressure that was not physical but psychic, a gaze that operated on the same frequencies as the lightning. Then the pressure shifted. The wing beats changed rhythm, and she felt the creature rise, felt the static diminish slightly, and she knew that it had made its selection. She heard, through the ringing silence of her shattered eardrum, a sound that was not a scream but a grunt, a single explosive exhalation of air that suggested a body being lifted, being compressed, being folded into a smaller space. Then the pressure was gone, the wing beats fading into the upper atmosphere, the static dropping to its baseline hum. Sarah's vision returned in patches, purple and green and gold, a kaleidoscope of damaged retina. She moved her fingers first, then her toes, then her arms, testing her nervous system for the damage that the discharge must have caused. There was pain everywhere, a systemic ache that suggested she had been tenderized by the electricity, but there was no paralysis, no burns that she could see. She crawled to her knees, gasping, and looked around the grove. Lewis was against a tree, his clothes smoking, his face blackened by the flash. He was alive, his eyes open, his mouth working soundlessly. David was 10 feet away, curled into a fetal position, his climbing axe still clutched in a hand that was blistered and red. He was breathing, shallow and fast, but he was breathing. Marcus was gone. There was no indentation this time, no circular depression in the earth. There was only a trail of broken branches leading into the underbrush, and a smear of blood on a sapling that suggested he had been taken not from above but from the side, snatched in mid-flight as he ran. Sarah looked up at the canopy, her vision still strobing, and she saw the hole in the branches, a perfect circle where the creature had plunged through the trees to take him, its body passing through gaps too narrow for any bird of natural size. The smear of blood was already attracting flies. The static was already rising again, tuning itself for the next pass. Sarah stumbled to Lewis and shook him until his eyes focused on her face. "The gorge," she said, her voice sounding distant and strange in her own head, her left ear a ringing void. "The limestone gorge on the eastern ridge. We can reach it by nightfall. The walls will protect us." She did not believe this. She knew, with a certainty that felt like prophecy, that the walls would not protect them, that the creature had already demonstrated its ability to penetrate the canopy, that the gorge was not a refuge but a trap. But she needed to move. She needed to give her companions a destination, a goal, a reason to keep walking when every instinct told them to lie down and wait for the end. Lewis nodded, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and David rose to his feet with a slowness that suggested his muscles had been partially cooked by the discharge. They gathered their packs, leaving Marcus's gear where it lay, and they moved through the forest with a speed that was not quite a run but was faster than a walk, a shambling trot that was driven by the animal knowledge that the predator was circling above them, preparing for the next strike. The gorge was 3 miles away. They covered the distance in 4 hours, moving through terrain that grew steeper and more broken with each mile, the forest giving way to scrub and then to naked rock as they climbed toward the eastern ridge. The static accompanied them, never fading, never intensifying, a constant reminder that the creature was there, waiting, patient. Sarah's left ear was a ringing void, but her right ear had begun to pick up a new sound, a rhythmic clicking that was not mechanical but biological, a sound like the stridulation of an insect amplified to a scale that suggested a source the size of an automobile. The creature was communicating, or perhaps only breathing, and the sound seemed to come from all directions at once, reflecting off the canyon walls until it became impossible to locate. They reached the gorge at twilight, the sun setting behind the western peaks in a display of colors that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. The gorge was a slash in the earth, a narrow defile perhaps 20 feet across at its widest point, its walls rising in vertical cliffs of limestone that had been carved by meltwater during the last ice age. The floor of the gorge was littered with boulders and scree, and the going would be treacherous in the dark, but Sarah did not care about treacherous. She cared about the walls. She cared about the fact that the gorge was too narrow for the creature to swoop, too confined for its wingspan to navigate. She cared about the illusion of safety, however temporary. They entered the gorge in single file, Sarah in the lead, Lewis behind her, David at the rear with his axe held in both hands. The walls rose around them like the jaws of a closing mouth, the limestone pale and luminous in the gathering dark, and for a moment Sarah felt something that approached relief. The static was weaker here, muffled by the rock, and the clicking had faded to a distant whisper. The creature could not reach them here. The creature would have to wait for them to emerge. But the creature did not wait. As they moved deeper into the gorge, the static began to rise again, not in volume but in pitch, climbing the frequency scale with a deliberation that suggested preparation. Sarah looked up and saw the sky above the gorge, a narrow strip of darkening blue between the walls, and she saw the shape pass overhead, silent and vast, blotting out the stars as it moved. It was too wide to enter the gorge. Its wingspan was greater than the width of the defile, but it did not need to enter. It only needed to hover above the opening, to position itself at the center of the strip of sky, and to do what it had evolved to do. The clicking began, not from around them but from above, a rhythmic sound that Sarah realized with a horror that felt like falling was not vocalization but percussion. The creature was rubbing its wings together. It was using the leading edges of its wing claws, the serrated keratin blades that Lewis had identified, scraping them against each other at a speed that generated friction, that generated heat, that generated charge. The clicking climbed in speed until it became a buzz, then a whine, then a scream that seemed to emanate from the sky itself, and Sarah understood in the last moment before the discharge what the creature was doing. It was not generating lightning. It was generating a static charge of such magnitude that the air itself became a conductor. It was turning the gorge into a Faraday cage in reverse, trapping them inside a channel that would channel the discharge directly to the ground, through their bodies, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. "Cover your eyes," Sarah screamed, but the words were swallowed by the roar of the creature's wings, and the flash that followed was not a flash but a sun, a detonation of light that burned through her closed eyelids and seared her retinas with an image that would never fade. The creature above the gorge, its wings spread wide, its body illuminated from within by the charge it had generated, a biological filament burning with a light that was not fire but electricity, pure and terrible and absolute. The discharge struck the floor of the gorge not 10 feet from where Sarah stood, and the world became a cascade of noise and light and pressure that drove her to her knees. She felt the heat of it, a flash fire that singed her hair and blistered her skin, and she smelled the ozone and the burning rock and the cooked meat smell of her own flesh. The limestone walls reflected the light in a strobe that turned the gorge into a kaleidoscope of white and shadow, and in that strobing light Sarah saw the creature descend, not flying but falling, folding its wings and dropping through the strip of sky like a spear, its talons extended, its eyes blazing. It took David first. He was closest to the center of the gorge, closest to the discharge point, and his body was still convulsing from the electricity when the talons closed around his torso. Sarah saw the hooks sink into his flesh, saw the blood spray in an arc that was black in the white light, and she saw David's face, his mouth open in a scream that produced no sound, his eyes wide and aware and horribly conscious of what was happening to him. The creature did not lift him immediately. It held him for a moment, its wings beating against the walls of the gorge in a thunder of displaced air, and Sarah saw the muscles of its hind legs contract, saw the tendons stand out like cables under tension. And then it rose, carrying David with it, his body dangling from the talons like a fish on a hook, his blood trailing in a spiral that painted the limestone walls. Sarah tried to raise her rifle, but her arms would not obey her, the muscles still spasming from the discharge. She tried to scream, but her throat was burned, her vocal cords paralyzed by the electricity. She could only watch, kneeling in the scree, as the creature rose above the gorge and hovered there, David's body twisting in its grip, and began to do what it had done to the deer, what it had done to the bear, what it had done to Alina and Marcus and Jeremy Holt and the 37 others in Finch's cabinet. It compressed him. The talons closed with a force that was not muscular but hydraulic, a pressure generated by the same system that produced the bioelectric discharge, and Sarah watched David's ribcage fold inward with a sound like a book being snapped shut. His spine accordion folded, the vertebrae grinding into powder, and his internal organs, intact and gleaming, were extruded through his pelvic girdle in a rope of gray and pink that glistened in the moonlight. The creature held him for a moment longer, inspecting its work, and then it released him, dropping the compressed body into the gorge where it struck the scree with a sound like a sandbag hitting concrete. The creature turned its head. Sarah felt its gaze upon her, a pressure that was not physical but psychic, a weight that seemed to be pressing her into the earth. She looked up, her eyes streaming tears from the flash burn, and she saw the creature's face for the first time, really saw it, not as a silhouette but as a biological reality. It was avian, yes, but not a bird. It was reptilian, but not a reptile. It was something that had evolved in a world where the rules were different, where flight was not a matter of lift and drag, but of electromagnetic manipulation, where predation was not a matter of tooth and claw, but of voltage and pressure. Its eyes were white, incandescent, the pupils vertical slits that seemed to contract as they focused on her, and in those pupils Sarah saw a reflection of herself, small and broken and waiting, a figure in a landscape that had already been measured and found wanting. The creature screamed. The sound was not a bird's cry but a jet engine tearing through metal, a shriek that contained harmonics beyond human hearing, that vibrated in Sarah's bones and teeth and the fluid of her inner ear. The limestone walls of the gorge seemed to sing in response, resonating with the frequency, and Sarah felt the rock beneath her begin to shake, to crack, to fail. The creature was not merely hunting. It was destroying the terrain that had sheltered them, using its voice as a tuning fork to find the resonant frequency of the limestone, to shatter the walls that had offered the illusion of protection. A boulder the size of a refrigerator broke free from the wall above her and crashed into the gorge floor, missing her by inches. Another followed, and Sarah realized that the creature was not trying to crush her directly. It was trying to bury her. It was trying to collapse the gorge, to seal her inside a tomb of rock and scree, and the horror of this method, the patient, systematic destruction of the environment itself, was worse than any direct attack could have been. Sarah ran. She did not know where she was running, only that she had to move, had to find a gap in the falling rock, a space between the boulders where her body could fit. The creature circled above the gorge, its wingbeats stirring the debris into a dust storm that filled the air with particles of limestone that cut her skin and burned her eyes. She stumbled, fell, rose again, her hands bleeding, her knees shredded, her rifle lost somewhere in the scree behind her. She could see Lewis ahead of her, running too, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his notebook clutched to his chest like a shield. And then she saw the rock slide. Not the one that was falling on them, but a potential one, a wall of loose scree on the western wall of the gorge that had been destabilized by the creature's scream, that was trembling on the verge of collapse. She understood, with a clarity that felt like divine intervention, that the minerals in the limestone, the calcite and dolomite and quartz, were conductive. They were grounding the creature's bioelectric field. They were disrupting its ability to sense them, to track them, to lock onto their nervous systems with its electrical targeting system. "Lewis," she screamed, her voice raw and broken. "The scree, we need to trigger the scree." He turned, his face a mask of dust and blood, and for a moment she saw incomprehension in his eyes. Then understanding dawned, the same understanding that had driven his research, the same obsession that had brought them here, and he nodded. He understood. The rockslide would not save them from the creature's physical attack, but it would create a grounded field of minerals that would disrupt its electrical senses, would break the lock that allowed it to target them with such precision. They ran toward the western wall, their bodies low, their hands finding purchase in the loose rock. The creature saw them and dived, its wings folding, its talons extended, and Sarah felt the wind of its passage like a physical blow that knocked her flat. But she was already at the base of the scree wall, her fingers finding the trigger point, the keystone boulder that held the rest in place. She put her shoulder against it, her legs braced, and she pushed with a strength that she did not know she possessed, a strength born of terror and desperation and the absolute refusal to die in this gorge, crushed and compressed and dropped from 3,000 feet. The boulder moved. It shifted with a grinding sound that was swallowed by the creature's scream, and then the wall collapsed. Not gradually, but catastrophically. 1,000 tons of limestone and scree pouring down into the gorge in a wave of rock and dust that filled the air with a roar that exceeded even the creature's cry. Sarah was thrown backward by the pressure wave, her body tumbling down the slope, and she felt the rocks striking her, bruising her, cutting her, but she did not feel the talons, did not feel the compression, did not feel the electricity. The rockslide buried the floor of the gorge in 10 feet of debris, and in the center of that debris, Sarah lay gasping, her body a catalog of pain, her vision filled with dust and stars. She could not see Lewis. She could not see the creature. The static was gone, replaced by a silence that was deeper and more absolute than any she had ever experienced. She lay there for a long time, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her broken ribs, and she waited for the talons to close around her, for the electricity to seize her muscles, for the compression to fold her into a smaller space. But the attack did not come. The creature screamed once more, a sound of frustration and rage that vibrated in her bones, and then the pressure lifted, the wingbeats fading into the upper atmosphere, the static dropping to a hum and then to silence. The rockslide had worked. The minerals had grounded the field. The creature had lost its electrical lock, and without that lock it was blind, a predator deprived of its primary sense, forced to retreat and wait for easier prey. Sarah crawled from the debris. Her left arm was broken, the bone visible as a sharp ridge beneath the skin. Her right ankle was sprained, swollen to twice its size. Her face was a mask of blood and dust, her hair singed, her clothes hanging in rags, but she was alive. She was intact. She had not been compressed. She found Lewis 20 yards away, buried to his waist in scree, his face pale and still. She dug him out with her one good hand, her fingers bleeding, her nails torn, and when she finally cleared his face, she saw that he was breathing, shallow and fast, but breathing. His eyes opened, and they looked at her with an expression that she could not read, a mixture of awe and terror and something that might have been gratitude. "The feather," he whispered, "I still have the feather." She wanted to strike him. She wanted to bury him back in the scree and leave him there. But she did not. She pulled him free, and together they limped through the gorge, through the rockslide, through the static that was already beginning to rise again in the distance, a reminder that the creature was not gone, only waiting. They walked for 2 days. They found water in a seep, food in the form of cattails and grasshoppers, and they moved through the wilderness with a speed that was driven by the knowledge that the creature was still hunting, still circling, still searching for the electrical signature that the rockslide had disrupted. On the morning of the 3rd day, they heard the sound of a helicopter, and Sarah used her satellite beacon, which had miraculously survived the ordeal, to signal their position. The rescue team found them on a ridge above the tree line, two figures in rags, their faces hollow with exhaustion and trauma, their eyes fixed on the sky with an expression that the rescue personnel later described as like they were waiting for something to fall on them. Sarah did not speak during the flight out. Lewis clutched his feather, his notebook, and his sanity with equal desperation, and he did not speak either. They were flown to a hospital in Seattle, where they were treated for dehydration, shock, electrical burns, and the bends. The real bends, diagnosed by doctors who could not explain how a patient at 7,000 feet could develop nitrogen embolisms. The doctors wrote it off as a statistical anomaly. Sarah knew better. They were released after a week, and Sarah returned to her cabin in Bellingham, where she sat on the porch and watched the sky with a vigilance that bordered on madness. She did not go back to guiding. She did not go back to the mountains. She stayed in the flatlands, in the places where the sky was wide and empty, and the trees were too short to hide anything larger than a crow. But she still heard the static sometimes in the dead of night, a subsonic hum that seemed to emanate from the stars themselves. Lewis published his paper. It was rejected by every peer-reviewed journal in the country, laughed out of conferences, mocked on blogs and in faculty lounges. But the feather, which he had managed to smuggle past the rescue team in the lining of his jacket, was real. It sat in a safe deposit box in a bank in Seattle, and Lewis visited it sometimes, sitting in the private room with the filament on the table between him and the guard, staring at its iridescent sheen with an expression that Sarah, had she seen it, would have recognized as the look of a man who had traded his life for a glimpse of something that should not exist. 6 months later, Sarah received a package in the mail. It was a photograph, taken by a satellite imaging company, showing the valley they had escaped. In the center of the photograph was a circle, 2 miles in diameter, where the trees had been bent outward in a radial pattern, their branches broken and blackened. The soil inside the circle had been turned to glass, a ceramic sheet that reflected the sunlight with a mirror brightness. And in the center of the circle, visible only if you knew where to look, was a shape. Not a bird, not a plane. Something that cast no shadow, that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, that waited in the center of its domain with the patience of something that had never learned the meaning of time. Sarah burned the photograph. She burned it in her wood stove, and she watched the ashes rise up the chimney and disperse into the sky, and she knew that the creature was still there, still hunting, still circling. And she knew that she would never go back, never look up, never listen for the static that was the signature of its passage. But sometimes on clear nights, when the sky was empty of clouds and full of stars, she heard a sound. It was not thunder. It was not a jet. It was a crack, sharp and sudden, that seemed to originate from directly overhead, under a perfectly blue sky, in a silence that was deeper than the silence of the grave. And when she heard that sound, she did not look up. She closed her eyes. She held her breath. She waited for the pressure to pass, for the static to fade, for the creature to move on to other prey. She did not look back. She never looked back. Because she knew that looking back was the last thing you did before the lightning found you, before the talons closed, before your skeleton was compressed into a smaller space, and your body was dropped from a height that no cliff could provide. To be found by a coroner who would write "hunting accident" on your death certificate and file you away in a cabinet that was already swollen with the victims of a predator that had evolved beyond the reach of human understanding, beyond the reach of human fear, into something that was as natural and as inevitable as the lightning that preceded it, and the thunder that followed, and the silence that swallowed them both. Lewis did not fare as well as Sarah in the months that followed. While she retreated into silence and vigilance, he retreated into obsession, the feather becoming the center of a gravitational pull that consumed what remained of his academic career, his relationships, and eventually his sanity. He set up a laboratory in his basement, a makeshift facility equipped with borrowed oscilloscopes, repurposed microscopes, and a Faraday cage that he constructed from copper mesh and aluminum foil. He subjected the filament to every test he could devise: electron microscopy, spectral analysis, tensile strength measurements, and electrical conductivity assays. The results were inconsistent with any known biological material. The keratin was not merely serrated but piezoelectric, generating measurable voltage differentials when subjected to mechanical stress. The microstructure was laminated in a pattern that resembled the stealth coatings used on military aircraft, designed to absorb rather than reflect electromagnetic radiation. And the DNA, when he finally managed to extract a fragment from the basal quill, was degenerate, a sequence of nucleotides that matched no entry in any genomic database, living or extinct. He tried to publish these findings in a series of preprints and blog posts that were met with the kind of enthusiastic dismissal reserved for flat earthers and moon landing deniers. His former colleagues at the University of Washington issued a statement distancing themselves from his work, suggesting that his traumatic experience in the Cascades had precipitated a psychiatric breakdown that had rendered him unfit for scientific discourse. The tech entrepreneur's family, Marcus Webb, had been declared legally dead. His body never recovered, threatened him with a lawsuit if he continued to use their son's name in connection with what they called delusional conspiracy theories. Lewis did not care. He had touched the feather. He had felt its serrated edge slice through the paper he had wrapped it in, had watched it generate sparks when rubbed against copper, had seen it bend light in ways that suggested a refractive index incompatible with terrestrial biology. He knew what he had found, and he knew that the world's refusal to believe him was not a measure of his madness, but of its own. By the following spring, Lewis had stopped leaving his house. He boarded the windows, not against burglars but against the sky, and he spent his days in the basement laboratory, monitoring the static with equipment that he had designed himself, antennas that could detect frequencies below the threshold of human hearing. He recorded the data in journals that grew in number until they filled the shelves that had once held his legitimate research, and he began to detect patterns that terrified him more than the creature itself. The static was not random. It was rhythmic, a series of pulses that repeated at intervals of 11.7 seconds, a frequency that matched the resonant mode of the Earth's ionosphere. The creature was not merely hunting in the valley. It was communicating, broadcasting a signal that traveled around the planet in the channel of charged particles that protected the surface from solar radiation, and the signal was growing stronger. He called Sarah one night in March, his voice hoarse and cracked, the connection filled with a hum that she recognized immediately. "It's not one creature," he said without preamble. "It's a network. They're everywhere. The valleys, the mountain passes, the restricted zones. They're marking territory. They're breeding." Sarah had hung up. She had not answered his calls since, but she had kept the memory of the photograph, the one she had burned, and in her mind she still saw the center of the scorched circle. And in that center, barely visible, was a shape that she had noticed before she burned it. Not one shape but two, a larger silhouette and a smaller one, positioned as though in instruction, as though the adult were teaching the juvenile the patterns of the hunt. The photograph had been taken 6 months after their escape. The breeding season, if that was what it was, had already begun. Sarah moved to the coast in April, to a small town on the Olympic Peninsula where the sky was rarely clear, and the trees grew so thick that the canopy was a solid roof of green. She rented a cabin on a cliff above the Pacific, a place where the wind blew constantly, and the sound of the surf was loud enough to drown out any hum that might try to reach her. She walked the beach every morning, her eyes on the sand, her mind emptied of everything except the rhythm of the waves. She did not look up. She did not look at the sky. She had learned in the hardest possible way that the sky was not empty. It was full of things that had evolved to hunt from above, things that used lightning as a weapon and pressure as a trap, things that compressed their prey into smaller spaces and dropped them from heights that turned the human body into a projectile of blood and bone. But the coast was not safe either. She learned this on a Tuesday in June, when the sky was clear and the surf was calm, and the static came not from above but from the horizon, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the water itself. She had been walking on the beach, her boots sinking into the wet sand, when she felt the pressure in her sinuses return, the familiar ache of decompression sickness that she had thought she had left behind in the Cascades. She looked up against her better judgment, against every vow she had made to herself, and she saw it. A shape on the horizon, silhouetted against the sun, its wings spread wide, their span so vast that they seemed to block half the sky. It was not moving toward her. It was simply there, hovering, riding the thermals that rose from the water with the same effortless patience that she had observed in the valley. She ran. She ran back to her cabin, her lungs burning, her ankle, the one she had sprained in the gorge, screaming in protest. She locked the doors, drew the curtains, sat in the corner with her back to the wall and her eyes on the ceiling, waiting for the discharge, waiting for the talons, waiting for the compression that would fold her into a smaller space and drop her from a height that no cliff could provide. But the attack did not come. The static faded after an hour, dropping to a hum and then to silence, and when she finally dared to look outside, the sky was empty. The creature had not been hunting. It had been scouting. It had been confirming what the photograph had already suggested, that the range of the Thunderbird, or whatever network of creatures the Thunderbird represented, was expanding beyond the mountain valleys, beyond the restricted zones, into the coastal regions where the human population was denser and the hunting was easier. Sarah sold the cabin. She moved to a basement apartment in Portland, a city of rain and clouds where the sky was rarely visible and the buildings were tall enough to block any view of what might be circling above. She took a job as a night watchman in a parking garage, a structure of concrete and steel with no windows and a roof that was thick enough to stop anything but a direct nuclear strike. She worked the graveyard shift, sat in the windowless office with her eyes on the security monitors, and she did not look up. She did not look at the sky. She had learned to live in the subterranean world, the world of foundations and load-bearing walls and reinforced concrete, the world that the creature could not penetrate with its lightning and its talons and its patient, systematic destruction. But she still heard the static. It came to her in dreams, a subsonic hum that vibrated in her bones and stirred her from sleep with a gasp and a racing heart. She saw the creature in her dreams too, not attacking but observing, its white eyes fixed on her with an expression that she had learned to read as appraisal, as measurement, as the cold calculation of a predator that had already assessed her weaknesses and was simply waiting for the optimal moment to exploit them. She woke from these dreams with her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms, and she would sit in the dark until dawn, listening to the rain on the pavement above her, waiting for the sound of thunder under a cloudless sky. Lewis was found dead in August. The police report, which Sarah obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, described the scene in language that was deliberately vague, suggesting a suicide that the coroner had been unable to confirm definitively. He had been in his basement laboratory, seated in his chair, his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. The Faraday cage had been torn apart, the copper mesh scattered across the floor in a pattern that suggested not vandalism but explosion, as though something had generated a force from within the cage that exceeded its capacity to contain. The feather was gone. The journals were intact, filled with observations that the police had classified as delusional rambling and filed away in a box marked evidence, do not release. But there was no body. Lewis had been alone in the house, the doors locked from the inside, the windows boarded, and yet there was no body. Only the chair, the scattered copper mesh, and a circular indentation in the concrete floor of the basement, 8 feet across. The concrete compressed to a ceramic hardness that the police report described as anomalous before moving on to the next case. Sarah attended the memorial service, standing in the back of the church with her hood pulled low, her eyes on the floor. She did not speak to Lewis's family. She did not speak to anyone. She only listened to the eulogy, delivered by a colleague who had not spoken to Lewis in 5 years, and she heard the words tragic loss and mental illness, and the dangers of obsession, and she knew that none of them understood. They had not seen the feather. They had not felt the static. They had not watched a man's ribcage fold inward like a book snapping shut, had not smelled the ozone and the cooked meat, had not heard the jet engine scream of a creature that had evolved beyond the reach of human fear. They were safe in their world of ordinary dangers, of car accidents and heart attacks and cancer, and they would remain safe until the day when the sky opened and the lightning found them. And then they would understand in the last moment before the compression what Lewis had understood, what Sarah understood, what the 37 victims in Finch's cabinet had understood, that the world was not governed by human rules, that the wilderness was not empty, and that the creatures that occupied the upper atmosphere were not myths but biological realities, apex predators of a scale and sophistication that made the grizzly bear and the great white shark seem like house pets by comparison. She left the church and walked to her car, parked on a street lined with maple trees that cast dappled shadows on the asphalt. The sky was blue, cloudless, the kind of day that people called beautiful. Sarah stood beside her car for a long moment, her keys in her hand, her eyes on the ground. Then she heard it, a crack, sharp and sudden, that seemed to originate from directly overhead. The sound of thunder under a perfectly blue sky. The signature of the static. The announcement of the predator's presence. She did not look up. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove away. She did not look back. She never looked back, because she knew that looking back was the last thing you did before the lightning found you, before the talons closed, before your skeleton was compressed into a smaller space, and your body was dropped from a height that no cliff could provide. She drove until the sound faded, until the static dropped to a hum and then to silence, until the city surrounded her with its concrete and its steel and its illusions of safety. But she knew, with a certainty that transcended fear and entered the realm of prophecy, that the illusions were temporary. The creature was still out there. The network was still expanding. And someday, perhaps soon, perhaps in a distant future that she would not live to see, the sky would open and the lightning would fall, and the world would learn what Sarah and Lewis had learned in the gorge. That the static in the canopy was not a weather phenomenon. It was a hunting call, and the hunt had only just begun. The Gilded Ossuary. The audio log began not with a scream, which would have been natural, nor with the static of a damaged recorder, which would have been expected, but with a whisper so controlled, so deliberately modulated, that it sounded less like a cry for help and more like a dictated memorandum from a man who had already accepted the terms of his own extinction. Dr. Amara Khalil, playing the file for what she would later realize was the final time, sat in the darkened command tent of Base Camp Anubis and listened to the voice of her mentor, Dr. Victor Sallow, emerge from the speaker with a clarity that made her skin prickle with contradictory sensations of intimacy and violation. "It didn't just move," Sallow whispered, his breath audible in the microphone, each exhalation measured as if he were afraid that the rhythm of his lungs would give away his position. "It folded. Do you understand? It folded itself into the ventilation shaft. I watched it happen. I watched its joints bend in directions that human joints do not bend, in directions that any joint should not bend, and it slid into the ductwork with a sound like wet leather being pulled through a tight ring. It is 14 inches tall. The duct is 8 inches square. The math is impossible, but the math does not matter anymore because I can hear it behind me. Not in front, behind. It is mimicking the sound of my own breathing. I inhale, and a fraction of a second later I hear the same inhalation from the vent above my left shoulder. It has learned my rhythm. It is using my heartbeat as a metronome. Amara, if you find this, do not open the tomb. Do not clean the specimen. Do not bring it into the light. The inscription was not a warning about a curse. It was a containment protocol. The guest was sealed because it could not be killed, and now I have rehydrated it. Now I have given it back its body, and its body is hungry, and it is standing right behind my neck, breathing in time with me, and I cannot turn around because if I turn around I will see it. And if I see it I will understand why the ancients buried it in black basalt and salt. I am going to stop the recording now. I am going to turn around. The click you hear will be the lock on the specimen crate, or it will be my throat. I do not know which. I do not. The recording ended. Not with a click. With a sound like a wet leather bag being turned inside out. A single, succinct inversion of pressure, and then the flatline hum of a recorder left running in an empty room. Amara sat in the dark and listened to the hum for 17 seconds before she realized she was not breathing. She exhaled. From the ventilation duct above her, a fraction of a second later, she heard the same exhalation. She did not look up. She simply reached for the camp stove, turned on the gas burner, and held the recorder over the flame until the plastic melted and the memory chip warped into a curl of silicon and ash. Then she stood, her legs trembling, her hand closing around the only weapon she had left, a geological hammer with a chipped head and a handle worn smooth by 20 years of field work. And she walked out of the command tent into the moonscape of the Egyptian desert, knowing that the thing Salo had described was no longer contained, no longer desiccated, no longer a curiosity for private collectors and academic journals. It was loose, it was learning, and the ruins with their 1,000 hiding places and their million gaps were its hunting ground. The story of how a 14-inch desiccated hominid became the apex predator of a limestone subtomb in the western desert began, as most academic disasters do, with funding. The expedition had been conceived in the climate-controlled offices of the Kaling Institute, a private research foundation bankrolled by a reclusive collector named Alastair Vance, whose fortune derived from cobalt mines, and whose hobbies derived from a fascination with the occult that he disguised, thinly, as an interest in anomalous antiquities. Vance had spent 30 years acquiring artifacts that did not fit the established chronologies, a Sumerian cylinder seal depicting a creature with too many joints, a Minoan fresco showing a sacrifice to a god that had no name in any known pantheon, a collection of pre-dynastic Egyptian burial dolls that were not representations of humans, but of something else, something with proportions that suggested a different evolutionary path, a parallel hominid that had learned to walk upright and use tools, and then had descended back into the earth, abandoning the surface to its larger, softer cousins. Vance had approached Amara Khalil in her office at the University of Cairo, offering a grant that exceeded her department's annual budget by a factor of 10, and he had presented her with a satellite image. The image showed a geological anomaly in the Gilf Kebir Plateau, a region so remote and so inhospitable that it had been surveyed only twice in the 20th century and never in the 21st. The anomaly was a sinkhole, approximately 40 meters across, surrounded by a rim of black basalt that did not match the local limestone geology. Vance's geologists had identified the basalt as volcanic, extrusive, and dated to a period that predated the oldest known Egyptian settlements by at least 4,000 years. "There is a structure inside the sinkhole," Vance had said, his fingers steepled, his eyes the color of faded banknotes. "Not a pyramid, not a temple, something older, something that was buried not for worship but for imprisonment. I want you to excavate it. I want you to find what is inside, and I want you to bring it to me." Amara had been 42 years old, a linguist of pre-dynastic scripts with a specialty in the proto-writing systems that had emerged in the Nile Valley before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. She had spent 15 years decoding the labels on pottery shards and the marks on bone tallies, building a vocabulary of a language that had no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text, only the stubborn persistence of symbols repeated across millennia with meanings that shifted like sand. She was respected in her field, well-published, well-regarded, and utterly bored. The offer from Vance had been not merely financial but existential, a chance to dig something that had never been catalogued, to read something that had never been translated, to touch history before it had been laundered into the acceptable narratives of pharaohs and dynasties. She had assembled her team with the care of a general choosing staff officers. Victor Sallow, 63, her former dissertation advisor, a physical anthropologist whose career had stalled in the 90s after a controversial paper on anomalous hominid remains found in a Moroccan cave. Hassan El Masri, the site manager, a practical man from Luxor who had supervised excavations from Alexandria to Aswan, and who regarded academics with the tolerant skepticism of a man who had seen too many theories collapse under the weight of actual dirt. Layla Farouk, 26, a junior archaeologist fresh from her master's program at Alexandria, brilliant and impatient and hungry for a discovery that would make her name before she turned 30. Jean-Pierre Dubois, a French structural engineer who specialized in the stabilization of underground chambers. Mei Chen, a geologist from Beijing who had come to study the anomalous basalt. Omar Nassar, a local foreman with a crew of 8 laborers who did the actual digging while the academics took notes. And 2 graduate students, Tariq and Samira, whose primary function was to carry equipment and complain about the heat. They had established Base Camp Anubis on the rim of the sinkhole in late October, when the temperatures in the western desert dropped from lethal to merely unbearable, and they had spent 3 weeks lowering themselves into the pit on ropes and scaffolding, clearing debris, mapping the structure that emerged from the limestone like a tumor from healthy tissue. The structure was not a tomb in any conventional sense. It was a subtomb, a claustrophobic vein of mineral-rich limestone that had been hollowed out not by human tools, but by a combination of geological faulting and deliberate excavation, the walls showing the marks of both natural solution channels and artificial chiseling, in proportions that suggested the original miners had followed the cave system rather than creating it. The entrance was a horizontal shaft, barely 4 feet high, that sloped downward at a 30-degree angle into darkness that smelled of bat guano and mineral salts and something else, something organic and ancient that Amara could not identify, but which made her throat tighten whenever she inhaled too deeply. The shaft opened into a series of chambers, each one smaller than the last, the ceilings dropping from 10 feet to 6 to 4, the walls closing in until the passages required them to crawl on their bellies, their headlamps cutting thin cones of light through air that seemed to absorb illumination like a sponge. The walls were covered with inscriptions, not hieroglyphics. Those came later, the elegant formal script of the dynastic period, but with an older system of marks, angular and jagged, pressed into the soft limestone with tools that had left V-shaped grooves rather than the U-shaped channels of Egyptian chisels. Amara photographed them, traced them, began the slow process of building a lexicon from context and repetition, and by the end of the second week she had translated enough to understand that the structure was not a burial chamber for a king. It was a cell. The inscription spoke of a guest that had come from below the roots, a creature that was not a god and not a demon but a visitor from the dark strata, something that had emerged from the earth's interior through a natural passage that the pre-dynastic people had discovered and then sealed. The language was not reverent, it was clinical, the vocabulary of containment rather than worship. The texts described the guest's biology with a precision that made Amara's skin crawl. It drinks the moisture of the body, read one passage. It folds itself into the spaces between stones. It waits without tiring. It enters through the gaps that the eye cannot see. Another passage, longer and more detailed, described the method of sealing. We have wrapped it in salt and basalt. We have dried its blood with desert wind. We have placed it in the smallest chamber where the air does not move, where the darkness is complete, where no hand will disturb the sleep of the guest. Let no one break the seal. Let no one give it water. Let no one give it warmth. For if it wakes, it will drink us all, and the spaces between our bones will become its corridors. Amara had read these passages to Sallow in the command tent, her voice shaking, and the old anthropologist had listened with an expression that was not fear but excitement, the gleam of a man who had spent his career chasing anomalies and had finally found the anomaly to end all anomalies. A subterranean hominid, he had said, his fingers drumming on the table. A parallel evolutionary branch that never left the caves. The implications are staggering, Amara. If we can extract DNA, if we can prove that this creature represents a separate lineage of hominid evolution, it rewrites the entire narrative of human origins. We won't just publish papers. We'll rewrite textbooks. She had tried to warn him. She had pointed to the containment language, to the terror that underlay the clinical descriptions, to the fact that the ancients had not buried the guest with gold or offerings or prayers, but had sealed it in salt and darkness and left warnings that spanned 5 millennia. But Sallow had been deaf to caution. He had seen only the prize, the specimen, the proof that would resurrect his career and cement his legacy. And Amara, swept up in his enthusiasm, infected by the proximity of discovery, had allowed him to proceed. The central chamber was found on the 23rd day of the excavation. It was the smallest space yet, a cavity barely 6 feet in diameter and 4 feet high, its walls polished smooth by unknown hands, its floor covered with a layer of black salt that crunched under their knees like coarse sugar. The air in the chamber was not merely dry but desiccating, a vacuum that sucked the moisture from their skin and left their lips cracked and bleeding. In the center of the chamber, resting on a pedestal of basalt that had been carved from the living rock, was the sarcophagus. It was tiny, 14 inches long and 8 inches wide, a coffin built not for a pharaoh but for a large doll, a black basalt box whose lid was sealed not with mortar but with a layer of crystallized salt that had fused the seams into a single, seamless surface. The lid bore no inscription, no cartouche, no symbol of royalty. Only a single mark, repeated in a pattern that covered the entire surface. A spiral, coiling inward to a point, the universal sign of contraction, of folding, of drawing something into a space smaller than itself. Amara photographed it from 12 angles, her hands trembling, her headlamp casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Sallow had wanted to open it immediately, to lift the lid and see what 5,000 years of darkness had preserved, but Hassan had intervened, insisting that they document the chamber fully, that they stabilize the structure, that they approach the sarcophagus with the respect due to something that had been buried with more care than any king. They had waited 3 more days, 3 days of measurements and photographs and anxious discussions in the command tent, 3 days during which Amara translated more of the inscriptions and found increasingly specific warnings. The guest must not touch water. The guest must not feel warmth. The guest must not be given air, for air is the breath of life, and life is the food of the guest. On the 26th day, Sallow had had enough of waiting. He had come to the chamber alone, early in the morning, before the rest of the team had risen, carrying a solvent of his own devising, a chemical cocktail designed to dissolve the crystallized salt without damaging the basalt beneath. He had read Amara's translations. He had seen the warnings. But he was a scientist, and the warnings were 5,000 years old, and the thing in the sarcophagus was 14 inches long and desiccated and dead, and science did not bow to superstition. He had applied the solvent with a brush, working slowly, carefully, the chemical reacting with the salt in a hissing effervescence that filled the chamber with a cloud of acrid vapor. The salt dissolved. The seal broke. And Sallow, his hands shaking with anticipation rather than fear, had lifted the lid. What he found inside would haunt him for the remaining 6 hours of his life. The creature was not a doll. It was not a mummy in the Egyptian sense, not a body preserved by ritual and resin. It was a biological entity that had been desiccated alive, its tissues not rotted but dried, its metabolism not stopped but suspended, trapped in a state of dormancy that was closer to cryptobiosis than death. It was 14 inches long, curled in a tight fetal position, its skin the color and texture of old leather, its limbs folded against its torso with a compactness that suggested joints capable of hyperflexion, of bending in directions that human joints could not achieve. The head was disproportionately large for the body, cranial and domed, with eye sockets that were not empty but covered with a translucent membrane that seemed to pulse with a faint, residual circulation. The fingers were long, multi-jointed, ending in nails that had grown into black hooks during the millennia of darkness. And the mouth, oh God, the mouth was the worst part, because it was not the mouth of a child or an infant but of an adult, fully formed, with a full set of teeth that were not baby teeth but adult incisors and canines, razor-sharp and complete, as if the creature had been born with the dentition of a predator and had never needed to develop beyond the hunting stage. Sallow had stared at it, his scientific detachment cracking like a patina of varnish over wood, and he had reached out to touch the skin, to feel the texture of the leather, to confirm with his fingertips what his eyes were telling him. The skin was warm, not warm from the desert. Warm from within. The creature was not dead. It was sleeping. And the air of the chamber, the moisture of Sallow's breath, the warmth of his body, were rehydrating it in real time, reviving tissues that had been waiting 5,000 years for a single breath of living vapor. He should have closed the lid. He should have reapplied the salt. He should have run. Instead, he had taken out his sample kit and his brushes and his bottles of preservative, and he had begun to work. He had lifted the creature from its sarcophagus, handling it with the care of a curator with a fragile artifact, and he had placed it on a sterilized aluminum tray. He had photographed it. He had measured it. He had used a small brush to clean the mineral crust from its skin, applying a second solvent, a mild acid designed to dissolve calcium deposits, and as the crust flaked away, the skin beneath had changed color, shifting from the gray-brown of desiccation to a pale, waxy pink, and the membrane over the eye sockets had begun to flutter. The metabolism, when it kicked in, did not accelerate gradually. It detonated. The creature's body had snapped into motion with the speed of a praying mantis, a sudden, violent uncoiling that had driven its elbow into Sallow's palm with a force that broke two of the anthropologist's fingers. The tray had clattered to the floor. The creature had landed on its feet, feet that were not feet but prehensile grips with opposable toes, and it had stood there for a fraction of a second, 14 inches of waxy pink skin and two large head and adult teeth, its chest heaving with the first breaths it had taken in 50 centuries, its eyes, now open, fixing on Sallow with a focus that was not confusion but recognition, not shock but hunger. And then it had moved. Sallow had never seen anything move like that. It did not run. It did not jump. It folded. Its spine compressed, its joints inverted, its limbs tucked against its torso until it was no longer a humanoid shape but a dense, articulated knot no larger than a football, and it had shot across the chamber floor with a speed that defied the eye, a blur of pink and black that vanished into a gap in the masonry before Sallow could raise his hands. The gap was 6 inches wide. The creature was 14 inches tall. The math was impossible, but the creature had not broken the laws of physics. It had simply bent them, using joints that rotated in 3 dimensions, using a skeletal structure that was not bone but something denser, more cartilaginous, more flexible, a biological architecture that had evolved in the narrow spaces between rocks and had never needed the open efficiency of human locomotion. Sallow had screamed then, a sound that was swallowed by the limestone walls, and he had scrambled backward, his broken fingers forgotten, his mind reduced to a single primal command: get out. He had crawled through the passages, his headlamp bouncing wildly, his breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed through the subtomb like the breathing of something much larger, and he had reached the command tent and locked the door and made the audio log that Amara would later burn. He had told her what he had done. He had told her what was loose. And then he had heard the sound from the ventilation shaft, the small, square duct that carried air from the surface to the underground chambers, a duct that was 8 inches across and that should have been too small for anything larger than a rat. He had heard the sound of wet leather being pulled through a tight ring. He had heard the breathing behind him, and he had made his final recording, and then he had turned around. Amara did not find Sallow's body until the following morning, when the rest of the team had gathered at the command tent, alarmed by his absence and by the strange sounds that had echoed through the ruins during the night. The clatter of falling equipment, the smash of glass, the scuttling of something moving through walls. The tent was intact. The door was locked from the inside, but Sallow was gone. The only evidence of his presence was the overturned chair, the scattered papers, and the blood. Not a pool of blood, not a spray, but a trail of droplets that led from his desk to the ventilation shaft, a trail that suggested he had not been dragged but had walked, or crawled, under his own power, leaving a breadcrumb of red that terminated at the duct. The duct cover was off, lying on the floor with the screws still in their holes, as if something had removed it from the inside. And inside the duct, visible in the beam of Amara's headlamp, was a smear of blood and a single object. Sallow's eyeglasses, bent and smeared with a thick mucus that smelled of sulfur and ancient minerals. Amara had reached into the duct, her arm extending to its full length, her fingers brushing the glasses, and as she did, she had felt a movement in the darkness beyond, a displacement of air that was not a draft but a presence, something moving away from her touch with a speed that made her jerk her arm back and scramble away, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The creature was in the ducts. It was in the walls. It was moving through the architecture of the ruins in ways that the humans could not follow, using gaps and chases and conduits that had been built for air and water, but were now serving as highways for a predator that was small enough to fit through them and fast enough to vanish before the eye could track. The first breach of psychological horror did not announce itself with an attack. It announced itself with absence. When the team entered the subtomb that morning, expecting to find the sarcophagus undisturbed and Sallow making notes in his field book, they found instead a scene of subtle, meticulous sabotage. The camera traps that had been placed throughout the chambers had been disabled, not smashed but disassembled, their lenses removed with a precision that suggested tool use, their memory cards extracted and snapped in half. The cables that ran from the generators to the lights had been severed, not chewed but cut, the copper exposed in clean, surgical slices that could only have been made by a blade or by a claw sharpened to a chisel's edge. The flashlights that had been cached in each chamber for emergency use had been smashed, their lenses ground into powder, their bulbs twisted from their sockets. The creature had spent the night not hunting but preparing, mapping the environment, identifying the tools that gave the humans advantage, and eliminating them with a strategic intelligence that was not merely animal but tactical. Amara walked through the chambers with her geological hammer raised, her headlamp the only remaining source of illumination, and she saw the marks on the walls, fresh scratches in the limestone, parallel lines that matched the spacing of the creature's claws, a trail that led from the central chamber to the ventilation shaft to the gaps between the masonry, a map of movement that described a creature capable of compressing its body to fit through openings that should have been impossible. And she heard the clicking. It was not a random sound. It was a pattern, a rhythmic series of clicks that echoed through the limestone with an acoustic ambiguity that made it impossible to locate. Sometimes it seemed to come from the left, from a gap in the wall that was barely visible. Sometimes it seemed to come from above, from the ventilation shaft that ran through the ceiling. Sometimes it seemed to come from behind, from the passage they had just walked through, and when they turned there was nothing there, only the darkness and the waiting stone. The clicking was the creature's echolocation, Amara realized, a biological sonar that mapped the chambers in 3 dimensions, identifying the locations of the warm, breathing bodies that had invaded its territory. It was not hunting them yet. It was studying them. It was learning their numbers, their movements, their vulnerabilities, and it was doing so with a patience that was more terrible than any attack. Jean-Pierre, the French engineer, had tried to convince them that the sounds were geological, the settling of the limestone, the expansion of the rock in the cooling night air. But when they found his measuring equipment crushed in its case, the calipers bent into shapes that suggested they had been used to gauge the width of a human neck, he stopped talking about settling. Omar, the foreman, had gathered his laborers and tried to leave, climbing the ropes to the surface in a panic-stricken rush that had ended when they found the surface camp in disarray. The water tanks had been punctured, their contents draining into the sand. The vehicle's fuel lines had been severed. The radio antenna had been snapped. The creature had been busy above ground as well as below, and its message was clear. No one was leaving. The ruins were sealed. The humans were inventory, and the inventory would be taken at the creature's convenience. The slaughter began at dusk, when the light was failing and the shadows in the subtomb seemed to deepen with a will of their own. Mei Chen was the first. She had gone to the eastern chamber to collect a basalt sample, her satchel over her shoulder, her mind preoccupied with the geological anomaly that had brought her to this place. She was a methodical woman, a scientist who believed in the verifiable world, and she did not notice the gap in the wall behind her, a gap no wider than a fist that had not been there when she had entered the chamber. She bent over her sample, her hammer raised, and she felt a touch on her ankle, a brief, cold contact that made her spin around, her headlamp sweeping the empty room. Nothing. She turned back to her work and the touch came again, this time on her other ankle, and she looked down to see a hand, a small, pale, multi-jointed hand, retracting into the gap with a speed that made her doubt her own vision. She screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the limestone, and she backed away from the gap, her heart hammering, her hammer raised. The creature did not emerge. It waited. It listened to her breathing, mapped her heartbeat, and when she had backed herself into a corner when she had nowhere else to go, it struck. It came from above. Not from the gap in the wall, but from a solution hole in the ceiling, a natural chimney in the limestone that May had not noticed, because it was only 4 inches across. The creature dropped through it like a spider descending on a thread, its body folded into a compact ball that expanded in midair, its limbs extending, its joints locking into position, and it landed on May's shoulders with a force that drove her to her knees. She screamed again, thrashing, her hammer swinging wildly, but the creature was already moving, its jaws closing around her Achilles tendon with a precision that severed the tissue cleanly, the razor-sharp adult teeth shearing through muscle and ligament as if they were paper. May collapsed, her leg useless, her blood pouring onto the limestone floor in a pool that steamed in the cool air. The creature did not kill her immediately. It moved to her other leg, its small hands gripping her ankle with a strength that belied its size, and it bit again, severing the other tendon, rendering her immobile, a broken toy that could not run. Only then, when she was disabled, did it begin to feed. But feeding was not the right word. It was harvesting. It dragged her toward the gap in the wall, the same fist-sized opening that May had seen earlier, and it began to fold her. Amara found the body an hour later, when May's screams had stopped and the clicking had resumed its patient, mapping rhythm. The sight was beyond anything she had ever encountered in her archaeological career, beyond anything she had seen in war zones or disaster sites. May had been forced through the gap. The creature had broken her limbs, folding them at the joints with a methodical precision that suggested anatomical knowledge, compressing her body into a shape that could fit through an opening no larger than a human head. Her arms were folded behind her back, her elbows bent until they touched, her wrists twisted until the bones had snapped. Her legs were folded forward, her knees pressed against her chest, her feet tucked under her chin. And her head, her beautiful, intelligent head with its short black hair and its wire-rimmed glasses, had been turned sideways and pushed through the gap first, the neck breaking with an audible crack that must have been the last sound she made. The gap was 8 inches square. May had been 5 feet 4. The creature had made her fit, and it had dragged her through, into the darkness beyond the wall, leaving only a smear of blood and mucus, and the echo of clicking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The team had gathered in the central chamber, the survivors huddled around the empty sarcophagus like pilgrims at a shrine that had been defiled. Amara had told them what she had found, her voice flat with shock, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her headlamp. Hassan had vomited into the black salt. Layla had screamed, a sound that was more rage than fear, and she had attacked the wall with her trowel, digging at the gap through which May had been taken, her nails tearing, her face contorted with grief and madness. Jean-Pierre had tried to restrain her, and in the struggle, they had both fallen against the sarcophagus, the black basalt box rocking on its pedestal, and Amara had seen something that made her blood freeze. The interior of the sarcophagus, now empty, bore marks that she had not noticed before. Scratches in the basalt, thousands of them made by claws over millennia, a record of the creature's confinement, a tally of the days and years and centuries it had spent scratching at the stone, waiting for someone foolish enough to open the lid. The guest had not been sleeping peacefully. It had been scratching. It had been planning. And now, thanks to Sallow's arrogance and her own complicity, it was free. They did not find Sallow's body. They found his blood, and they found his recorder, and they found his boots, standing upright beside the command tent with the laces tied in a knot that was not his usual style. But they did not find the man himself. The search party, led by Hassan and accompanied by Jean-Pierre and the graduate student Tariq, had combed the surface camp and the upper chambers of the sub-tomb with the methodical desperation of rescue workers searching a collapsed building. They had found the drag marks in the sand, a trail that led from the tent to the sinkhole's rim and then stopped, as if the body had been lifted and carried across a distance that no human could traverse without leaving further evidence. They had found the torn fabric of Sallow's shirt, caught on a thorn bush that grew from a crack in the basalt, the cloth stained with a mucus that smelled of sulfur and ancient minerals. But the body was gone, consumed or stored or folded into some crevice in the rock that their flashlights could not penetrate. Tariq, who was 24 and had come on the expedition because he thought archaeology was safer than his father's construction work, had been the one to find the boots. He had stood over them, his headlamp illuminating the leather, his face pale with a comprehension that he could not articulate. "It's playing with us," he had whispered, his voice cracking. "It's leaving things like a cat with a mouse." Hassan had struck him across the shoulder, not hard, but enough to break the spell. "Don't talk like that," the foreman had said, his own voice rough with fear. "It's an animal. Animals don't play, they hunt, they eat, and when they're full they stop." But they all knew, even as Hassan spoke the words, that the creature was not full. It had been waiting 5,000 years. Its appetite was not biological but territorial, a need to reclaim the space that had been its prison and transform it into its kingdom. The second attack came 3 hours after May's death, when the survivors had attempted to barricade themselves in the antechamber that connected the central tomb to the surface shaft. They had dragged crates of equipment and bags of plaster into the passage, stacking them in a wall that they hoped would impede the creature's movements, though they knew in their hearts that the barricade was futile against something that could pass through gaps the size of a human fist. Tariq had been assigned to watch the rear, his flashlight sweeping the darkness behind them, his ears straining for the sound of clicking that would signal the creature's approach. He had been brave, or brave enough, a young man who had not yet learned the specific quality of fear that comes from knowing exactly what is hunting you. He stood at the edge of the barricade, his back to the wall, his flashlight beam playing across the crates, and he heard a sound that was not clicking but breathing. Not his own breathing, though it matched his rhythm exactly. A breath that emerged from the gap between 2 crates, a space no wider than 4 inches, a space that should have contained only dust and darkness. He leaned closer, his curiosity overriding his caution, his flashlight beam narrowing on the gap, and he saw an eye. Not a human eye, though it was positioned where a human eye would be. A pale, translucent orb with a vertical pupil that contracted in the light, an eye that did not blink but simply stared, mapping his face, his temperature, his pulse. Tarek screamed, a high, girlish sound that did not match his broad shoulders, and he stumbled backward, his flashlight falling from his hand. The creature did not emerge from the gap. It did not need to. The gap was merely a window. The door was beneath Tarek's feet. They had not noticed the solution channel in the floor, a natural conduit in the limestone that ran parallel to the passage, hidden beneath a layer of loose gravel that the creature had apparently excavated during the night. The gravel moved. The floor seemed to ripple, and then a hand emerged from the stones, a small, pale hand with multi-jointed fingers that closed around Tarek's ankle with a grip that felt like a hydraulic press. Tarek went down, his legs buckling, his body crashing against the crates with a force that drove the air from his lungs. He kicked with his free leg, his boot connecting with something soft and yielding that made a sound like a wet cough, but the grip did not loosen. Another hand emerged, gripping his other ankle, and then the creature's head appeared, rising from the gravel like a horror from a child's nightmare, its too large cranium dusted with limestone powder, its adult teeth bared in a rictus that was not a snarl but a smile, the smile of a predator that had cornered its prey and was now simply enjoying the moment before the kill. Tarek screamed again, this time a continuous wail that echoed through the passage and brought the others running, but they were too far away, blocked by the barricade they had built, and the creature worked with a speed that was clinical in its efficiency. It did not go for the throat. It did not go for the face. It went for the tendons. Its jaws closed around Tarek's left Achilles with a precision that Amara would later describe as surgical, almost delicate, the razor-sharp incisors shearing through the calcaneal tendon, with a single, scissoring motion that left the foot attached only by skin and the intact fibula. Tarek's scream reached a register that no human throat should have been able to produce, a sound that was part agony and part disbelief, and the creature moved to the right leg, repeating the procedure, rendering him immobile in less than 3 seconds. Then it began to drag him, not across the floor but into the hole in the floor, the solution channel that led to the lower strata of the limestone, a passage that was 8 inches wide and that dropped at a 45-degree angle into darkness. Tarek was 5 feet 10, broad-shouldered, a man who weighed 80 kilograms. The creature was 14 inches tall and weighed perhaps 5 kilograms soaking wet. But it dragged him with an ease that suggested its musculature was not proportional to its size, that its strength derived from a density of tissue that human anatomy could not achieve, a compact power that turned the creature into a biological winch. Tarek's fingers clawed at the floor, his nails breaking against the limestone, leaving parallel gouges that matched the marks on the sarcophagus lid, and he screamed for Hassan, for Amara, for anyone, but his body was already sliding into the hole, his legs folding as the creature pulled, his hips compressing as the passage narrowed, his shoulders twisting in their sockets with a series of pops that sounded like gunshots. The others reached the barricade in time to see his head, his beautiful, terrified head with its close-cropped hair and its acne scars, disappear into the floor, his screams becoming muffled, then distant, then rhythmic, then wet, as the creature folded him into the passage and began to feed. They heard it. That was the worst part. The passage carried sound with a clarity that was almost intentional, a geological amplification that turned the lower strata into a resonating chamber, and they heard every moment of Tarek's consumption. They heard the clicking, rapid now, excited, a staccato rhythm that suggested the creature was working quickly, efficiently, harvesting the moisture and the warmth before the prey could cool. They heard the wet sounds of flesh being parted, of joints being disarticulated, of meat being compressed and swallowed whole by a throat that could expand to accommodate pieces larger than its own head. They heard the cracking of bones, not snapped but folded, bent until the collagen sheath split and the marrow leaked out, and they heard Tarek's voice, reduced to a gurgling moan, finally silenced by a sound like a heavy boot stepping on a wet sponge. And then for a long time they heard nothing. Nothing but the clicking, slow and satisfied, moving away through the lower strata, leaving behind a passage that smelled of copper and sulfur and the particular sweetness of digested protein. Hassan stood at the barricade, his face gray, his hands shaking, and he whispered a prayer in Arabic that Amara did not understand but that she felt in her own chest, a vibration of grief and terror that synchronized with her heartbeat and made her want to tear her own skin off just to feel something other than helplessness. Samira had watched Tariq vanish with a dissociative stillness that would later require sedation, and Layla had rushed to seal the gaps with wire mesh until the creature's hand shot from an unnoticed crack and snapped her wrist like a dry branch. Only Hassan's strength and Jean-Pierre's rebar had pried the pale fingers open, sending the thing squealing back into the stone. Now the survivors huddled in the antechamber, their breath shallow, their eyes tracking every shadow, every seam, every dark aperture in the limestone that breathed with a patient, ancient hunger. The clicking stopped. The silence that followed was not empty, it was occupied. The antechamber had become a confession booth in which no one dared to speak, a limestone vault where 5 survivors knelt not in prayer, but in the paralyzed observance of a predator they could not see, touch, or comprehend. Amara sat with her back against the sarcophagus pedestal, the black basalt cold even through her field jacket, her geological hammer resting across her knees with a futility that mocked her. She had counted the gaps in the chamber's architecture, 17 visible fissures in the walls, ranging from the width of a pencil to the width of a human thigh, 4 solution channels in the floor, their openings concealed beneath gravel that seemed to shift of its own accord when she was not looking directly at it, and the ventilation shaft in the ceiling, a square duct that had carried Sallow's last breath and now carried only the scent of sulfur and the memory of wet leather. The creature was in all of these places, and none of them. It occupied the architecture the way a spider occupies a web, not as a resident but as an extension of its own nervous system, and the survivors were flies who had blundered into the threads and were now waiting for the vibration to summon the mouth. Hassan sat opposite her, his legs folded beneath him in the posture of a man who had spent his life praying in mosques and was now improvising faith in a godless cavern. He had not slept in 36 hours. His eyes were bruised pockets of flesh, the whites threaded with ruptured capillaries that gave him the appearance of a man who had been weeping blood. He held a rebar in his hands, a 3-foot length of rusted steel that he had pried from the barricade, and he turned it over and over with a mechanical rhythm that was the only thing keeping his hands from shaking. Jean-Pierre lay on his side near the passage entrance, his face turned toward the wall, his breathing shallow and irregular. He had developed a fever in the hours since Tariq's death, a low-grade heat that Amara suspected was psychosomatic, but which nonetheless alarmed her, because fever meant shivering and shivering meant vibration, and vibration was the language the creature used to map its prey. Layla sat with her broken wrist cradled against her chest, her face pale and greasy with shock, her lips moving in a continuous, soundless monologue that might have been equations or prayers or simply the repetition of her own name, an anchor against dissociation. And Samira sat apart from them all, in the corner farthest from the gaps, her knees drawn to her chin, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that existed only in the architecture of her trauma. They had been in the antechamber for 6 hours. They had no water. The creature had punctured the tanks. They had no food. The protein bars in their packs had been torn open and scattered, not eaten but sampled and discarded, the wrappers showing the precise puncture marks of adult teeth too small to belong to any desert scavenger. They had no light beyond their headlamps, and the batteries were failing, the beams growing yellower and more diffuse with each passing minute, as if the darkness itself were feeding on the electricity, and they had no hope of rescue. The radio was destroyed. The vehicles were sabotaged. The surface camp was a graveyard of equipment, and the nearest human settlement was 200 kilometers across a desert that would kill them in a day without water. They were alone with the guest, and the guest was patient. The clicking resumed at 3:47 a.m., according to Amara's watch, though time had become a theoretical concept, a fiction maintained by the movement of hands on a dial, while the real universe operated on the creature's schedule. It began as a single click, sharp and dry as a fingernail snapping against bone, emerging from the ventilation shaft directly above Samira's head. She did not look up. She had not moved in 4 hours, had not spoken in 6, and the click produced no visible reaction in her except a slight widening of the eyes, a dilation of the pupils that swallowed the iris until her eyes looked like drops of spilled ink. Then a second click answered from the floor, from the solution channel near Jean-Pierre's feet, and a third from the wall behind Hassan, and a fourth from the gap through which May had been taken, and the pattern emerged, a quadrilateral of sound, a sonic cage that mapped the chamber and located each heartbeat with the precision of a GPS satellite. The creature was counting them. It was confirming the inventory, and it was choosing. It chose Samira, perhaps because she was the youngest, perhaps because her stillness made her appear already dead, an easy harvest, perhaps because the creature, in its alien intelligence, recognized that she had surrendered, and that surrender was a scent it could follow, a pheromone of resignation that smelled sweeter than defiance. No one saw it enter. The gap above her head was barely 3 inches wide, a vertical crack in the limestone that had been invisible until the headlamp beam happened to cross it at the correct angle. But they heard the sound of wet leather being drawn through stone, a slow, deliberate extraction that suggested the creature had been wedged in the crack for hours, waiting, its body compressed into a density that defied its volume, its joints folded like a closed pocket knife. Samira's head tilted, a movement so slight it might have been a muscle spasm, and her eyes focused on something above her, something that her face did not register as surprise but as recognition, as if she had been expecting this visitor since the moment she had watched Tariq vanish into the floor. The hand emerged first. Amara saw it in the periphery of her vision, a pale, multi-jointed appendage that unfolded from the crack like the petals of a mechanical flower, each finger extending with a series of audible pops that suggested the creature was resetting its joints into their operational configuration. The fingers were longer than a human's, too long, segmented at points where no knuckle should exist, and they ended in nails that had grown during the millennia of darkness into black, chitinous hooks capable of scoring basalt. The hand reached down toward Samira's head with a tenderness that was more terrible than any violence, and it stroked her hair, a single, gentle pass that left 4 parallel tracks in the sweat-soaked strands. Samira did not flinch. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing, her body relaxing into a posture of infantile trust, and Amara understood with a clarity that made her want to scream that the creature was not merely hunting but harvesting, that it had identified in Samira a pliability that made her the most efficient target, the path of least resistance through which it could begin its culling. The hand withdrew. For a moment, nothing happened, and Amara allowed herself to believe that the creature had merely been curious, that it had touched the girl and found her wanting and would now move on to other prey. Then the crack widened. Not cracked, not broke, widened, as if the limestone itself were yielding, as if the creature's body were exerting a pressure from within that forced the stone to accommodate its passage. A shoulder emerged, pale and waxy, the skin glistening with a mucus that smelled of sulfur and ancient minerals, and then the head, the too large cranium with its translucent eye membranes fluttering in the headlamp light, and then the torso, the 14-inch body unfolding from a space that should have been physically impossible, joints bending, spine compressing, limbs articulating in directions that made Amara's own joints ache in sympathetic protest. The creature stood on Samira's shoulder, its feet gripping the fabric of her shirt with toes that were opposable and prehensile, and it looked at Amara, not at the others, At Amara, its eyes, filmed and pale, seemed to lock onto hers with a focus that was not predatory but evaluative, as if it were measuring her against some standard she could not comprehend, assessing her moisture content, her warmth, her viability as future prey. Then it bent down, its mouth opening, and it bit Samira's neck. The bite was not deep. It was precise. The creature's adult teeth, those razor-sharp incisors that had evolved not for tearing but for shearing, penetrated the skin at the junction of the neck and shoulder, severing the external jugular with a single, scissoring motion that produced a spray of blood no larger than a teacup's worth. Samira's eyes opened, but she did not scream. She gasped, a soft, aspirated sound that might have been relief, and her body went limp, not from shock but from something the creature had introduced through its saliva, some enzyme or neurotoxin that paralyzed the voluntary muscles while preserving consciousness. The creature did not feed at the neck. It fed at the wrist, the broken wrist, Layla's broken wrist. No, Samira's wrist, Amara's mind correcting itself in a frenzy of denial. It had moved to the girl's wrist with a speed that blurred the eye, and its teeth closed around the radial artery, shearing through the vessel with the same surgical precision it had applied to Tariq's tendons. Blood welled up, dark and viscous in the failing light, and the creature began to drink. Not suck, drink. Its throat moved with rhythmic swallows, and its body, as it fed, began to change color, the waxy pink deepening to a flushed red, the desiccated tissues plumping with rehydrated vitality, the skin taking on a sheen that suggested health, vigor, hunger satisfied and thus renewed. Samira watched it feed. Her eyes were open, conscious, aware, and Amara saw in them an expression that was not pain but wonder, as if the girl were witnessing a miracle rather than her own exsanguination. The creature's head moved with the gentle rhythm of a nursing infant, its body hunched over the wrist like a gargoyle in prayer, and the clicking that had resumed around the chamber now changed timbre, becoming softer, almost purring, a sound of satisfaction that made Amara's stomach contract with revulsion. Hassan had risen to his feet, the rebar raised, but he did not strike. He could not strike. The creature was using Samira as a shield, positioning its body so that any blow would land on the girl first, and even if he could have hit it, the speed with which it had moved suggested that it would be gone before the steel completed its arc. They watched, the survivors, paralyzed by a horror that was too intimate to interrupt, too deliberate to oppose, and they listened to the soft, wet sounds of feeding that filled the chamber with an acoustics of violation. When the creature had finished, it did not kill Samira. It left her alive, conscious, bleeding slowly from the wrist and neck, her body depleted but not destroyed, and it climbed back into the crack with a speed that mocked gravity, folding itself into the stone with a series of wet pops that faded into silence. The crack narrowed behind it, the limestone seeming to flow like candle wax and then resolidify, though Amara knew this was illusion, a trick of shadow and exhaustion, and yet the effect was undeniable. The wall appeared healed, seamless, as if the creature had never emerged. Samira slumped against the stone, her breathing shallow, her skin the color of candle wax, and she whispered a single word before consciousness left her. Cold. Amara crawled to her, her veterinary instincts. No, her human instincts. Her instincts as a woman who had once held a dying friend in a Cairo hospital and had learned the tactile vocabulary of mortality, taking over her scientific detachment. She tore strips from her shirt and bound the girl's wrist, the blood soaking through the cotton immediately, and she pressed her palm against the neck wound, feeling the pulse flutter beneath her fingers like a trapped bird. Samira was going into shock. Her skin was clammy, her pupils were unequal, and her body temperature was dropping, not from blood loss alone but from something else, something the creature had taken from her that was not merely fluid but vitality, a thermal extraction that left her colder than the limestone itself. "We need to warm her," Amara said, her voice cracking. "We need blankets, we need fire." But they had none of these things. They had only their own bodies, and they arranged themselves around Samira in a huddle of shared heat that was pathetically insufficient against the chill that the creature had introduced into her core. It was during this huddle, during the desperate press of flesh against flesh in the darkness of the antechamber, that Amara made the connection. She felt Samira's cold, the unnatural, bone-deep cold that was spreading from the bite wounds like frost through window glass, and she remembered the inscriptions. It drinks the moisture of the body. The creature was not merely a predator. It was a desiccator, a biological mechanism designed to extract moisture and warmth from living tissue, to harvest the aqueous content of its prey and leave behind husks that resembled the creature's own dormant state. The ancients had sealed it in salt and darkness because salt absorbed moisture, because darkness preserved cold, because the only way to contain the guest was to deprive it of the two things it needed to function, water and heat. Sallow's solvent had not merely awakened it. It had rehydrated it, had given it the moisture necessary to restore its metabolic processes, and now it was harvesting the expedition to maintain itself, drinking their warmth and their water and their life, leaving them as dry and brittle as the black salt that had lined its sarcophagus. "It needs moisture," Amara whispered, the realization crystallizing in her mind with the sharpness of a broken tooth. "And warmth. That's why it didn't kill Samira outright. It took her heat. It took her water. It's storing her, keeping her alive so it can feed again, like a refrigerator." Hassan looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light, and she saw the moment when he understood, when his engineering mind grasped the biological implication. "Then we need to deprive it," he said. "We need to make this place dry, colder, we need to become unappetizing." "We can't," Jean-Pierre croaked from his corner, his voice thick with fever. "We're mammals, we produce heat, we sweat, we breathe out moisture. As long as we're alive, we're food." The silence that followed his words was the silence of a death sentence, and Amara felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a shroud. But Hassan was not finished thinking. He turned the rebar over in his hands, his eyes focusing on the middle distance with an intensity that suggested he was watching a blueprint unfold in the darkness. "The specimen crate," he said. "The transport crate Sallow brought for the basalt samples. It's steel, reinforced, airtight, with a rubber seal around the lid." Amara remembered it, a heavy box, 4 feet by 3 by 3, lined with foam padding, designed to transport fragile geological specimens without exposing them to air or vibration. It was in the equipment cache near the surface shaft, 50 meters away through passages that the creature had already proven it could navigate with impunity. "We can't reach it," Layla said, her voice a thread of sound. "It'll get us before we get halfway." "Not if we distract it," Hassan replied. "Not if we give it something it wants more than us." The plan that emerged over the next hour was desperate, crude, and born of exhaustion rather than inspiration. But it was the only plan that did not end with them huddled in the antechamber waiting to be consumed one by one. They would retrieve the crate. They would lure the creature into the central chamber, where the sarcophagus still sat on its pedestal, a symbol of its former confinement that might trigger an instinctive response. They would use the high-pressure saline spray from the medical kit, a canister of sterile saline used for cleaning wounds, pressurized to deliver a jet strong enough to strip debris from lacerations. And they would spray the creature in the face, blinding its sensory organs with a concentration of the very moisture it craved, overwhelming its receptors with a flood of saline that would, Hassan theorized, trigger a momentary sensory overload, a biological short circuit that would give them the seconds they needed to slam the lid and seal the locks. It was insane, it was suicide, but it was all they had. Samira died during the planning, not from the creature but from the cold, her body finally surrendering to the thermal extraction that had begun with the bite, her heart slowing, and then stopping with a finality that was almost gentle, a last exhalation that smelled of copper and frost. They closed her eyes and left her in the corner, a warning to the creature that its inventory had been reduced, and they prepared themselves for the journey to the surface shaft. Jean-Pierre was too weak to walk, his fever having climbed to a temperature that made him delirious, and they left him with a flashlight and the rebar, instructing him to strike the stone if the creature approached, to make noise, to fight. He nodded, his eyes glassy, and Amara did not know if he understood or if he was already beyond understanding. They moved in single file, Amara in the lead with the geological hammer, Hassan behind her with the saline canister, Layla bringing up the rear with her broken wrist tucked against her chest and a trowel in her good hand. The passages were dark, their headlamps cutting thin, trembling beams through an absolute blackness that seemed to push back against the light, and every shadow contained the potential of movement, every gap the promise of a pale hand. They reached the equipment cache without incident, the silence so complete it felt like a trap, and they found the crate where Hassan had remembered it. A heavy steel box with reinforced corners and a rubber-sealed lid, the kind of container that could hold a vacuum, that could preserve a specimen for decades, that could become a prison if the prisoner were small enough and the jailers desperate enough. They dragged it back to the central chamber, the steel scraping against the limestone with a sound that seemed loud enough to summon every predator in the desert, and they positioned it near the sarcophagus, the open lid facing the chamber's entrance, the interior dark and inviting. Hassan primed the saline canister, his thumb on the trigger, his body trembling with a combination of fear and fever. Layla stood by the lid, her good hand gripping the handle, ready to slam it shut, and Amara stood in the doorway, the geological hammer raised, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that she was certain the creature could hear from 100 meters away. They were bait. They were offering themselves as the lure, and the trap was a steel box and a spray of salt water. The creature did not keep them waiting. It had smelled their movement, heard their heartbeats, mapped their positions with the clicking that now filled the chamber like the ticking of 1,000 clocks. It emerged from the gap above the sarcophagus, unfolding itself from the stone with a wet, popping grace that made Amara's knees weak. It dropped to the pedestal and stood there, 14 inches of waxy pink skin and adult teeth, its eyes fixed on Amara with that same evaluative focus, its head tilting as if it were asking a question she could not understand. Then it moved, not toward Amara but toward Layla, recognizing perhaps that she was the weakest, the injured, the most efficient target, and it crossed the chamber floor with a speed that blurred the eye, a pink streak that resolved into a nightmare of teeth and fingers. "Now!" Hassan screamed, and he fired the saline spray, the jet striking the creature square in the face with a force that drove it backward, its hands rising to shield its eyes, its mouth opening in a sound that was not a scream but a hiss, a high-pressure exhalation of superheated vapor that smelled of sulfur and ancient minerals. The creature thrashed, blinded, overwhelmed by the moisture it craved but could not process in such concentration, its sensory organs flooded with saline, and Layla slammed the lid down with a cry of pure, desperate fury. The steel rang like a bell, and Hassan threw his body across the lid, his weight pinning it shut, and Amara dropped the hammer and scrambled for the locking mechanism, her fingers finding the hasp, the latch, the padlock that they had brought from the equipment cache. But the creature was not defeated. From inside the crate came a sound like a pneumatic drill, a rapid, rhythmic hammering against the steel, and the lid began to lift, Hassan's body rising with it as if he weighed nothing, the creature's compact strength generating a force that defied its size. Amara grabbed the lid, her hands burning on the cold steel, and she threw her weight across it, adding to Hassan's, and together they held it down while Layla, weeping, fumbled with the padlock. The creature's hand emerged through the gap between lid and crate, a pale, multi-jointed claw that raked Amara's forearm, laying open the skin in 4 parallel lines that welled with blood. And she screamed, not from pain but from the proximity of that mouth, those teeth, the memory of Samira's wonder as she had watched herself being consumed. The padlock clicked, the hasp engaged, the lid held, and from inside the crate the clicking resumed, slow and patient and eternal, the sound of a creature that had waited 5,000 years and could wait 5,000 more. They had done it. They had trapped the guest. But as they leaned against the steel, gasping, bleeding, weeping, Amara looked at her arm and saw the blood welling from the scratches, and she knew that the creature had tasted her. It had her scent. It had her warmth. And in the darkness of the crate it was learning. It was waiting, and it would never, ever forget. The padlock was not enough. Amara knew this even as she leaned against the crate, her blood seeping into the steel, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted of sulfur and desperation. The padlock was a human contrivance, a mechanism designed to thwart human thieves, and the creature inside the crate was not human. It had scratched basalt. It had folded itself through gaps 8 inches wide. It had waited 5,000 years for freedom, and a padlock the size of her fist was not going to contain it for long. Already she could feel the vibration through the steel, a low, rhythmic thumping that was not frantic but methodical, the sound of something testing the boundaries of its prison with the patience of a geologist measuring erosion. The creature was not trying to escape. It was studying the crate. It was mapping the steel, and when it understood the architecture of its confinement, it would find the weakness, the gap, the flaw in the human design that would allow it to fold itself into freedom. "We need to move," Hassan said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Now, before it learns." He was right. The central chamber was a death trap, a limestone vault with 100 gaps and 100 hiding places, and the creature's packmates, if there were packmates, if the inscriptions about guests plural were accurate, might already be converging on the sounds of struggle. Amara pushed herself away from the crate, her arm burning where the creature had raked her, and she looked at Layla. The junior archaeologist sat on the floor beside the sarcophagus, her broken wrist cradled against her chest, her face a mask of shock and exhaustion. She had slammed the lid with a strength that had surprised them all, but that strength had cost her, and she was trembling now, her body shaking with a combination of adrenaline depletion and the onset of shock. "Jean-Pierre," Amara said. "We can't leave him." Hassan nodded, though his eyes told her that he had already calculated the odds and found them unfavorable. They dragged the crate toward the antechamber, the steel screaming against the limestone in a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead, and they found Jean-Pierre where they had left him, slumped against the wall near the passage entrance, the rebar still clutched in his hand. He was dead, not from the creature but from the fever, his body having climbed to a temperature that had cooked his brain, his face frozen in an expression of serenity that was more terrible than any scream. His skin was dry, Amara noticed, dry as parchment, and she understood with a sickening clarity that the creature had not needed to kill him. It had harvested him remotely, had drawn the moisture from his body through the very air, a thermal vampire that could feed without touch. The antechamber smelled of copper and sulfur and the particular sweetness of digested protein, and the creature in the crate thumped harder, as if it could smell the dead engineer and was frustrated by the steel that prevented it from claiming its due. They left Jean-Pierre where he lay. There was no time for burial, no time for prayers, no time for the rituals that separated humans from scavengers. They had the crate, and the crate was their only hope, and they dragged it through the passages toward the surface shaft with a desperation that bordered on madness. The crate was heavy, heavier than it should have been, as if the creature inside were adding its own weight to the steel, or as if the steel itself were becoming denser under the influence of whatever biology the guest possessed. Amara pulled from the front, her geological hammer thrust through her belt, her hands gripping the steel handles with a white-knuckled intensity. Hassan pushed from behind, his shoulder against the crate, his feet digging into the loose gravel for purchase. And Layla walked between them, her good hand steadying the lid, her broken wrist hanging useless at her side, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead with a focus that suggested she was not seeing the passage but something beyond it, something that existed only in the architecture of her trauma. They reached the surface shaft without incident, but the shaft was not the salvation they had hoped for. The rope that had lowered them into the subtomb had been severed, cut cleanly at a height of 3 meters, the frayed ends dangling in the darkness like the tentacles of a dead jellyfish. The scaffolding that had supported their excavation had collapsed, its wooden planks scattered across the shaft floor in a tangle of splinters and rusted nails. And the metal ladder that had been bolted to the shaft wall, had been torn from its brackets, the bolts bent and twisted as if by hands that were not human, the metal rungs crushed into shapes that suggested they had been used to gauge the width of a human torso. The creature had been busy during the night, not merely hunting, but preparing, sabotaging their escape routes with the same strategic intelligence it had applied to the water tanks and the vehicles. "We can't climb," Layla said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Not with the crate, not with my wrist." "We have to," Hassan replied, his eyes scanning the shaft walls, looking for handholds, for ledges, for any geological feature that might support their ascent. But the shaft was smooth, the limestone walls polished by ancient water flow and modern excavation, and the only way out was the severed rope and the missing ladder. They were trapped, and the crate was thumping, 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 the sound echoing through the shaft like a second heartbeat, a pulse that synchronized with their own and made Amara's skin crawl with the sensation of being mapped, measured, catalogued. It was then that Omar appeared. The foreman emerged from a side passage that they had not noticed, a narrow fissure in the shaft wall that opened onto a lower stratum of the ruins, and his appearance was so unexpected that Amara almost struck him with the hammer before she recognized his face. He was not alone. 2 of his laborers were with him, men whose names Amara had never learned, men who had done the actual digging while the academics had taken notes. They were alive, but barely, their faces gaunt and gray, their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes sunken in sockets that looked like thumbprints pressed into wet clay. They had been hiding in the lower strata since the surface camp was sabotaged, drinking their own urine to survive, eating the mineral salts that lined the walls in a desperate attempt to maintain electrolyte balance. They were walking corpses, and they stared at the crate with an expression that was not hope but resignation, as if they had seen enough to know that the steel box contained not salvation, but merely a different species of death. "The sinkhole," Omar croaked, his voice barely audible over the thumping. "The extraction truck, it's still there. The creature didn't sabotage it. It didn't reach it." Amara felt a spark of hope, a tiny, flickering ember in the darkness of her despair. The extraction truck was parked on the rim of the sinkhole, half a kilometer from the surface shaft, loaded with empty crates and sampling equipment. It was a heavy-duty 4-wheel drive vehicle, a Toyota Land Cruiser modified for desert terrain, and it had a winch, a radio, and enough fuel to reach the nearest settlement. If they could reach it, if they could load the crate, if they could drive. "How?" Hassan asked, his voice rough. "The shaft is blocked, the rope is cut." Omar pointed to the fissure from which he had emerged. "There's another way, a natural passage. It leads to the surface to the south rim, but it's narrow, very narrow." He looked at the crate and his expression told them what he was thinking. The crate would not fit through a narrow passage. The creature would have to be transported some other way or left behind or... "We carry it," Amara said, the decision forming in her mind with a clarity that surprised her. "We find a wider passage, or we dismantle the crate and rebuild it on the surface." "No," Hassan said, his voice sharp. "We don't open that crate, not for any reason, not ever." He was right, and they all knew it. The creature inside was learning the steel, mapping the locks, calculating the pressure points. To open the crate now, even for a second, would be to invite disaster. They needed another way. The way revealed itself in the form of a geological survey report that Omar had carried in his pocket, a laminated sheet of coordinates and topographical data that he had kept as a talisman against the chaos of the dig. The report showed a second sinkhole, smaller than the main excavation site, located 300 meters to the west, connected to the subtomb by a natural passage that was wide enough for a human to walk upright, but narrow enough to exclude anything larger. The passage ended at the bottom of the second sinkhole, a vertical shaft that opened to the surface through a gap in the limestone rim. They could lower the crate through the shaft, using the winch cable from the extraction truck, and then haul it up to the surface. It was desperate, complicated, and dependent on equipment that might not be functional, but it was a plan, and a plan was the only thing standing between them and the complete dissolution of their sanity. They moved through the lower strata with the crate between them, a funeral procession in reverse, carrying not a body to burial but a prisoner to uncertain confinement. The passages were tight, the limestone pressing against their shoulders, and the crate scraped against the walls with a sound that seemed to synchronize with the creature's thumping, as if the steel and the biology inside were communicating, negotiating, planning. The laborers helped carry, their emaciated bodies finding strength in the proximity of escape, and Omar led them with a sure-footed confidence that suggested he had memorized these passages during his days of hiding, had mapped them in his mind with the precision of a surveyor. They lost the first laborer in a chamber that they had not expected. The passage widened unexpectedly, opening into a space the size of a cathedral, its ceiling lost in darkness, its walls covered with the same pre-dynastic inscriptions that Amara had translated in the central tomb. But these inscriptions were different. They were not warnings. They were records. Tallies of victims, marks scratched into the limestone in groups of 5, the universal language of counting, and the groups extended across the entire visible surface of the wall, hundreds of them, thousands, a census of death that spanned millennia. The laborer, a man whose name Amara would never learn, stopped to stare at the wall, his hand reaching out to touch the marks, and he did not see the gap in the ceiling, the solution channel that widened as it descended, the pale shape that unfolded from it like a flower blooming in reverse. The creature that dropped from the ceiling was not the guest. It was something else, something larger, something that had evolved in the deeper strata where the passages were wider and the prey was more abundant. It was 3 feet tall, not 14 inches, and its body was not waxy pink but the color of old bruises, purple and yellow and black, the skin thickened and armored with calcified plates that had grown from the mineral-rich water that dripped through the limestone. Its head was still too large for its body, still cranial and domed, but the adult teeth had grown into tusks that projected forward like the mandibles of an ant. And the eyes, when they opened, were not pale and filmed but black and shiny, obsidian orbs that reflected the headlamp light with a mocking intelligence. It landed on the laborer with a sound like a sandbag hitting concrete, and the man had time to scream once before the creature's jaws closed around his skull, the tusks penetrating the temples with a precision that suggested anatomical knowledge, and the scream became a gurgle as the creature lifted him, held him aloft like a trophy, and began to drink from the wounds. The others ran. There was no thought of fighting, no thought of rescue, only the primal imperative of flight, the muscle memory of prey that has seen the predator and understands that its only hope is distance. They dragged the crate with them, the steel scraping against the floor, the thumping inside accelerating to a frenzied rhythm that matched their own panicked heartbeats. The second laborer stumbled, his weakened legs failing him, and Omar turned back to help, but the creature was already moving, dropping the drained husk of the first laborer and lurching after them with a speed that defied its bulk. It moved like the guest, folding and unfolding, joints bending in impossible directions, but it was less precise than its smaller cousin, less surgical. It was a brute, a soldier to the guest's assassin, and it smashed into the second laborer with a force that drove the man against the wall, his ribs snapping like dry twigs, his breath leaving him in a wet explosion that painted the limestone in a fan-shaped spray of arterial red. Omar screamed, a sound that was part rage and part grief, and he charged the creature with a rock he had torn from the floor, a jagged fragment of limestone the size of a human head. He struck the creature's shoulder, the rock connecting with a sound like a hammer striking a cast-iron pot, and the creature turned, its obsidian eyes fixing on Omar with an expression that was not anger but curiosity, as if it were surprised that the prey had learned to fight back. It struck him once, a single, economical blow with its tusked head that caught him in the abdomen and lifted him off his feet, and Omar flew backward, his body describing a graceless arc through the air, and he landed against the wall with a force that cracked his pelvis and drove the breath from his lungs in a spray of blood and bile. The creature advanced on him, its jaws opening, its tongue. Oh God, its tongue was not a tongue but a proboscis, a tube-like appendage that extended from its throat and fastened onto Omar's neck with a wet, sucking sound. And Amara turned away, dragging the crate because there was nothing they could do, nothing they could do, nothing they could do. They ran through the passages with the sounds of feeding behind them, the wet, rhythmic sounds of a creature that was not merely eating but harvesting, extracting moisture and warmth with an efficiency that made the guests seem delicate by comparison. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs cramped, until the crate felt like it was filled with lead rather than a 14-inch predator, and they emerged finally into the second sinkhole, the vertical shaft that opened to the sky above. The night was visible as a circle of stars, impossibly distant, impossibly beautiful, and the extraction truck was silhouetted against the horizon, its headlights dark, its engine silent but intact. They had made it. They had survived. But Layla had not survived the run. She had stumbled in the final passage, her broken wrist catching on a protrusion of rock, her body twisting as she fell, and the creature, not the large one but the guest, the original guest, which had apparently escaped the crate through some mechanism they could not comprehend, some folding of steel that should have been impossible, had been waiting for her. It emerged from a gap in the wall with a speed that was almost casual, almost bored, and it bit her ankle, severing the Achilles tendon with a single, scissoring motion that left her screaming and crawling. Amara turned back, her hammer raised, but Hassan grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "We can't," he hissed. "We'll lose the crate, we'll lose everything." And he was right, and she hated him for being right, and she watched as the creature dragged Layla into the gap, the junior archaeologist's screams becoming muffled, then distant, then wet, as she was folded into the stone and consumed with the same patient efficiency that had claimed Tariq. They lowered the crate into the sinkhole using the winch cable, the steel spinning out into the darkness with a sound like a fishing reel, and they secured it to the truck's bed with chains and padlocks, layers of containment that felt futile even as they applied them. The crate thumped, rhythmic, patient, eternal, and Amara sat in the passenger seat with her head in her hands, her body shaking with sobs that she could not control, while Hassan drove, his eyes fixed on the desert ahead, his face a mask of grim determination that barely concealed the terror beneath. The drive to the deep sinkhole took 3 hours, 3 hours of bouncing across desert terrain that threatened to overturn the truck at every dune, 3 hours of listening to the thumping from the bed, 3 hours of watching the stars and wondering if they would ever see another sunrise. They did not speak. Speech required energy they did not have, and words required meanings that no longer seemed adequate to describe what they had experienced. They were not archaeologists anymore. They were not scientists. They were survivors, and survivors did not need words. They needed silence and distance, and the absolute certainty that the thing in the crate could never be allowed to reach another human being. The deep sinkhole was not on any map. It was a geological anomaly, a vertical shaft in the limestone that dropped to a depth they could not measure, its rim overgrown with thorn bushes that clawed at their clothes as they dragged the crate to the edge. The sun was rising, painting the desert in bands of amber and rose, and the air was cool and dry and smelled of dust and distance. Amara stood at the rim and looked down, her headlamp useless in the daylight, her eyes straining to penetrate the darkness of the shaft. She could not see the bottom. She could not hear an echo. The sinkhole was a mouth in the earth, a throat that led to the dark strata from which the guest had originally emerged, and it was the only fitting prison for a creature that could not be killed, only returned. They pushed the crate over the edge. It did not fall immediately. It hung for a moment on the rim, the chains clinking against the stone, and then it tipped slowly and began to descend. They did not hear it hit bottom. They listened for a full minute, 2 minutes, 3, and there was no sound of impact, no distant crash of steel against stone, only the fading whisper of the chain unspooling into the abyss. And then from the depths, they heard the thumping resume, rhythmic, patient, eternal, growing fainter as the crate descended, but never stopping, never ceasing, never dying. Amara destroyed the coordinates first, burning the laminated survey report with a cigarette lighter that Hassan had found in the glove compartment, watching the plastic curl and blacken and melt into a shapeless lump of carbon. Then she destroyed her field notes, tearing the pages from her journal and feeding them to the wind, watching the paper scatter across the desert like white birds fleeing a fire. Then she destroyed the radio, smashing the receiver with her geological hammer until the circuit boards were fragments, and the antenna was a twisted spiral of aluminum. And finally, she destroyed the memory cards from her camera, grinding them beneath her boot into a powder of silicon and plastic that would never yield an image. Hassan watched her without speaking. He understood. They had not trapped a specimen. They had not discovered a new species. They had opened a door that should have remained sealed, had released a predator that had been contained by civilizations older than their own, and they had survived not through courage or intelligence but through luck and sacrifice, and the willingness to abandon everything they had once believed about the order of the world. They were not heroes. They were witnesses, and witnesses had a duty not to speak but to remember, to carry the weight of what they had seen in silence, to ensure that no one else would ever be curious enough to dig. They drove back to civilization in silence, the truck's engine the only sound in the vast expanse of the desert. They reached Aswan 3 days later, their bodies gaunt and sunburned, their eyes hollow with a knowledge that they could not articulate. They reported the expedition as a failure, a cave-in that had buried the site and their colleagues, a tragedy of geology rather than biology. They did not mention the guest. They did not mention the crate. They did not mention the thumping that still echoed in their dreams, rhythmic, patient, eternal. Years later, Amara would wake in the night with the sound of clicking in her ears, and she would lie in the darkness of her Cairo apartment, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she would listen. Sometimes the clicking was only the settling of the building, the expansion of the concrete in the cooling night air. But sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, she would hear a second clicking, answering from the ventilation shaft above her bed, and she would lie perfectly still, not breathing, remembering Sallow's last words. "It hears the pulse." She would lie there until dawn, her body rigid with terror, and when the sun rose and the clicking stopped, she would rise and go to her work, her face composed, her hands steady, her heart forever beating in time with a rhythm that had originated in the dark strata of the earth. She never returned to the desert. She never spoke Hassan's name aloud, though she saw him occasionally in the streets of Luxor, his face aged beyond his years, his eyes meeting hers with a recognition that required no greeting. They had made a pact, the two of them, a vow sealed not in words but in the shared experience of having looked into the mouth of something older than humanity and survived by the slimmest of margins. They did not exchange Christmas cards. They did not send emails. They simply existed in parallel, two broken people carrying a secret that would destroy the world if spoken, a secret that thrummed in their bones like a second pulse. And sometimes, on the nights when the wind blew from the west and the desert sand scratched against her window like the claws of something trying to enter, Amara would open her laptop and type the coordinates of the sinkhole into a search engine, and she would watch the satellite image load, and she would see the black dot in the limestone, the mouth in the earth, the prison that was not permanent. She would stare at that image for hours, her finger hovering over the print button, her mind racing with the possibilities. A call to the authorities, a warning to the scientific community, a publication that would make her famous and save lives. But she never pressed the button. She never made the call, because she knew with a certainty that had calcified in her heart like the mineral deposits in the limestone that the guest was still down there. It was still thumping. It was still waiting. And the only thing preventing it from returning to the surface was the silence of two broken people who had agreed, in the desert dawn, that some doors should never be opened, some tombs should never be disturbed, and some guests should never, ever be invited in from the cold. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.